In the early hours of July the 17th, 1918, a family was led down 23 steps to a semi-basement room in a merchant's house in Yekaterinburg. The room was small, roughly 25 feet by 21, with a vaulted ceiling, striped wallpaper, and a single window behind an iron grille. There were no chairs. The mother asked for one. Two were brought. She sat in the first. Her son, 13 and too frail to stand, was placed in the second. The father positioned himself in front of them, as though shielding still meant something in a room where it did not. Behind him, 4 daughters stood in a row. They had sewn diamonds into their corsets. They did not know they were dressing for their deaths. 11 people waited for a truck they believed was coming to move them. What came instead was a squad of armed men, a sentence read from a piece of paper, and a father who had just enough time to repeat it back as a question before the shooting began. 16 months earlier, this family had stood at the center of one of the largest empires on earth, photographed on yachts and palace terraces, visited by their British cousins, surrounded by the oldest royal network in Europe. The public story of their destruction is that they fell with the Russian Revolution. The private story is different. This is the story of the door that almost opened, the offer of asylum from the British Crown, made by a cousin who looks so much like the father in that basement that their photographs were mistaken for one another and then quietly, administratively withdrawn. It is the story of 2 monarchies, 1 family, and the price of institutional survival. But to understand how that family ended up in that room, how a dynasty that had ruled one of the largest empires on earth for more than 300 years could be reduced to a huddle of exhausted bodies in a basement in the Urals, you have to go back further than the revolution, further than the war. You have to go back to a Europe in which royalty still believed that blood was a kind of insurance policy, that the tangled, intermarried family tree connecting every throne on the continent meant something more than ceremony. This is the story of 2 branches of that tree, one that learned to cut itself back in time and survived, and one that could not and was destroyed. It is the story of cousins, of courts, of letters written and then quietly buried, and of a door that opened for one terrible, hopeful moment in the spring of 1917 before closing again, with a softness that disguised its finality. It is the story of 10 lives and 2 monarchies, and what happened when the oldest promise in the royal playbook, that family would protect family, met the modern machinery of institutional survival. To tell it properly, you have to begin with what the names meant. The Romanovs, by the early 20th century, were not simply a royal family. They were a political system. They had held the Russian throne since 1613, when the first Romanov Tsar was elected by a national assembly in the chaos following the time of troubles. A decade of famine, civil war, and foreign invasion that had nearly erased Russia as a sovereign state. From that broken beginning, the dynasty built an empire that stretched from the Baltic coast to the Pacific Ocean, from the frozen Arctic to the steppes of Central Asia. The scale was almost incomprehensible to the British public. Russia under the Romanovs was autocracy made visible. Vast military parades through St. Petersburg's imperial avenues, gilt-encrusted palaces whose rooms numbered in the hundreds, a court that ran on rigid hierarchy and religious ceremony, and a sovereign who answered, in constitutional terms, to nobody. The Tsar was not a constitutional monarch in the British mold. He was an absolute ruler, anointed by God and hedged about by doctrine, in a century that was steadily making absolutism fatal. The wealth that sustained the system was not a family fortune in the way a British country house dynasty might understand it. It was the wealth of the state itself, revenues drawn from a vast agrarian empire, from the mineral riches of Siberia, from customs duties and crown lands that blurred the boundary between personal property and sovereign treasury. The Romanovs' palaces were not inherited houses. They were instruments of governance. The Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, with its 1,050 rooms. The Alexander Palace at Tsarskoye Selo, the more intimate country residence to which Nicholas and Alexandra increasingly retreated. The Livadia Palace in Crimea, rebuilt in white limestone at a cost that ran into millions of rubles. These were not merely homes. They were stages on which the drama of sacred autocracy was performed for a population of 170 million people, most of whom lived in conditions so distant from those palaces that the 2 Russias might as well have occupied different centuries. The British monarchy, by contrast, had spent the better part of 200 years learning a different survival strategy. The Windsors, though they were not yet called the Windsors, and that fact matters enormously to this story, represented continuity through adaptation. The House of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, as it was officially known before 1917, had yielded power to Parliament century by century, attached itself to the naval empire, and cultivated the appearance of being a national institution rather than a dynastic one. The British sovereign opened Parliament, received ambassadors, conferred honors, reviewed troops, and performed the rituals of state, but did not govern. The real power lay with the Prime Minister, the Cabinet, and the House of Commons, and the Crown's survival depended on never being seen to interfere with that arrangement while quietly influencing it at every turn. Where the Romanovs projected sacred authority, the British Crown projected stability. Where Russia's monarchy depended on mystique and distance, Britain's depended on public trust, the careful performance of ordinariness, and the management of a mass press that could make or break a sovereign's reputation in a single editorial cycle. Both depended, more than either would have admitted, on the ability to control what the public saw. The difference was that the British monarchy had built an entire institutional apparatus: private secretaries, press offices, carefully staged public appearances, relationships with newspaper proprietors, to manage that control, while the Romanovs still relied on the older, blunter instruments of censorship, secrecy, and the assumption that sacred authority did not need to explain itself. And here was the thing that made the entire story possible: the detail that turns a geopolitical tragedy into a family one. The two dynasties were not merely allies or diplomatic counterparts. They were blood. George V, who sat on the British throne from 1910 until his death in 1936, and Nicholas II, the last emperor of Russia, were first cousins. Their mothers, Alexandra of Denmark and Dagmar of Denmark, were sisters, daughters of a King Christian IX of Denmark, the man sometimes called the father-in-law of Europe because his children married into so many of the continent's reigning houses. George and Nicholas had known one another since boyhood. They had holidayed together, reviewed one another's navies, stood side by side in uniforms heavy with braid and decoration. They had been photographed together with such frequency and looked so strikingly alike. The same beard, the same brow, the same careful posture of inherited authority, that the pictures were sometimes mistaken one for the other. In the visual language of monarchy, they looked like brothers. And that resemblance would become one of the cruelest details of the whole story, because it created the impression that kinship meant safety, that if the worst came, the family would close ranks, the way families do. It did not. There is something about that assumption, the assumption that royal blood carried an obligation of mutual protection, that has to be understood before the story can continue. Because the entire tragedy turns on the difference between what the extended European royal family appeared to be and what it actually was by the second decade of the 20th century. On the surface, it was still a network, interconnected, ceremonially intimate, bound by marriages, godparenthoods, shared holidays, and a calendar of visits and commemorations that gave the whole system the appearance of a functioning kinship structure. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany was George's first cousin on his father's side. Nicholas was George's first cousin on his mother's side. The three men, the rulers of Britain, Russia, and Germany, could sit down to a family dinner. They could sign their private letters with pet names. And within the space of a few years, their empires would be at war, their peoples dying in trenches, and the kinship that had once looked like stability would look instead like a grotesque irrelevance. The family tree was real. The safety net was not. On the Russian side, the dynasty's fragility was structural and long-standing. Nicholas II had inherited the throne in 1894 at the age of 26, following the sudden death of his father, Alexander III, a physically enormous, politically repressive czar who had kept order through sheer force and who died of nephritis at the age of 49, leaving his eldest son a crown that felt less like a gift than a burden. Nicholas was, by most accounts, a man of personal decency and domestic warmth who was catastrophically mismatched to the demands of his position. He believed in autocracy as a sacred trust, not because he was power-hungry, but because he had been raised to understand the Tsar's authority as something God-given and indivisible. He could not yield it without feeling he was betraying his oath, his father, and his faith. That rigidity was not a character flaw in the way a screenwriter might frame it. It was a worldview absorbed from childhood, reinforced by every institution around him and confirmed by a wife whose own certainty made his look moderate. It was also, by 1914, an increasingly dangerous way to govern a country that was industrializing, radicalizing, and losing patience with a political system that offered no mechanism for dissent short of revolution. The revolution of 1905 had already cracked the foundation. A peaceful workers' march to the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg on January 22nd of that year, known afterward as Bloody Sunday, was met with gunfire from imperial troops. Estimates of the dead varied, but the political damage was unambiguous. The massacre ignited strikes, mutinies, and rural uprisings across the empire. For months, the autocracy tottered. Nicholas was forced to concede a constitution and a parliament, the Duma, but he never fully accepted the concession. He viewed the Duma not as a partner in governance, but as an unwelcome constraint. And he used the fundamental laws he promulgated alongside it to retain the power to dissolve it, to appoint and dismiss ministers without parliamentary approval, and to rule by decree and emergency, which in an autocracy could be defined as broadly as the autocrat wished. The result was a political system that satisfied almost nobody. Too liberal for the old court, too authoritarian for the reformers, too unstable for the millions, whose grievances had driven them into the streets. That instability did not go away. It receded, simmered, and waited. The throne survived 1905. Whether it would survive the next crisis was a question that hung in the air of every chancellery in Europe. And in London, where the British establishment washed with a mixture of sympathy and calculation, the lesson drawn from 1905 was not that the Romanovs were doomed, but that they were a liability, the kind of relative whose difficulties might, if one were not careful, become contagious. On the British side, the picture looked steadier, but carried its own anxieties. George V came to the throne in 1910, not as the heir who had been groomed for it and that had been his elder brother, Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence, who died of pneumonia in 1892 at the age of 28, but as the dutiful second son who had spent his formative years in the Royal Navy and arrived at kingship with a temperament better suited to the quarterdeck than the drawing room. He was methodical, disciplined, conservative in taste and instinct, not intellectually adventurous, and possessed of an almost obsessive attention to matters of dress, protocol, and form. He collected stamps, he shot grouse, he kept a detailed diary, he liked routine, disliked surprises, and regarded the more theatrical aspects of monarchy with a suspicion that bordered on distaste. He was also, crucially, a man who understood, perhaps instinctively rather than intellectually, that the British monarchy survived not by asserting its power, but by managing its image. The crown's legitimacy rested on the appearance of being above politics, which in practice meant being exquisitely sensitive to politics at all times. George read the newspapers with care. He monitored public sentiment through his private secretary and through informal networks that reached into Parliament, the press, and the military. He understood that the British public's tolerance for monarchy was conditional, that it depended on the monarchy appearing useful, dutiful, and above all national rather than foreign. That understanding would become the single most important factor in the Romanovs' fate. Not because George was indifferent to his cousin, but because he was not willing to risk his own institution to save him. The women who stood beside these two men shaped the story as deeply as the men themselves, and each in her own way illuminated the difference between a monarchy that would survive and one that would not. Alexandra Feodorovna, born Princess Alix of Hesse and by Rhine in 1872, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, came to Russia as a young bride and never fully belonged there. She was shy where the court expected grandeur, intense where it expected social ease, and German-born at a time when Germany was Russia's principal military rival. She converted to Russian Orthodoxy with a convert's fervor, embraced a mystical, inward-looking piety that bewildered the Petersburg aristocracy, and built her emotional world almost entirely around her husband and children. In public, she was perceived as cold, aloof, and foreign. In private, she was anxious, controlling, and consumed by the need to protect her family from threats she believed were everywhere, political, spiritual, medical. That protectiveness was not irrational. Her only son, Alexei, born in 1904 after 4 daughters, suffered from hemophilia, an inherited bleeding disorder, passed through the maternal line from Queen Victoria's descendants. The condition meant that any fall, any bruise, any minor injury could become a life-threatening internal hemorrhage, and its management consumed the household's emotional energy, warped its judgment, and drew into the family's innermost circle the one figure who would do more than any other single person to discredit the dynasty in the eyes of the Russian public. Grigory Rasputin, the Siberian mystic whose apparent ability to ease Alexei's suffering gave him an influence over Alexandra that appalled the court, the government, and eventually the country. It was Alexei's illness that made Rasputin possible. And it was this secrecy surrounding that illness that deepened the Romanovs' isolation, because a family that cannot explain its most consequential decisions to the world becomes, over time, a family the world stops trusting. Queen Mary, born Princess Victoria Mary of Teck in 1867, was Alexandra's counterpart in function, though almost her opposite in temperament. Where Alexandra was emotional and mystical, Mary was intellectual, disciplined, and temperamentally suited to monarchy as an institutional project rather than a personal drama. She had been engaged first to George's elder brother, Albert Victor. After his death, she married George, and the transition, though awkward in the telling, reflected the dynastic logic of the era. A suitable consort was a suitable consort, and personal feeling was expected to follow duty. Mary brought to the British court a seriousness of purpose, a deep knowledge of royal tradition, and a formality that complemented George's own rigidity. She was not, as some later gossip traditions have suggested, the hidden engine behind Britain's refusal to shelter the Romanovs, but she was part of the emotional weather of a court that had learned to put institutional survival above personal sentiment, a court in which warmth existed but was never permitted to override calculation. The palace in which Mary operated was not a family home that happened to have political significance. It was a political institution that happened to contain a family. That distinction mattered more than anyone outside its walls would ever fully understand. The man who translated that institution's anxieties into action was Lord Stamfordham. Arthur Begge, George Fee's private secretary, the courtier who occupied the narrow, powerful space between the monarch and the government. Stamfordham had served Queen Victoria before George, and he understood the mechanics of royal influence with a precision that most politicians underestimated. He was not a villain in the melodramatic sense. He was a survival strategist, a man whose entire professional life had been spent ensuring that the crown emerged from every political difficulty with its reputation intact and its options preserved. His function, in the months that mattered most, was to convert the palace's atmospheric fear of public opinion into specific documented pressure on government ministers. To ensure that what the king felt became what the government did, without the king being seen to have directed it. He wrote letters, he flagged concerns, he reported the mood of the country with the care of a man who understood that mood was policy. And when the asylum question reached its crisis in the spring of 1917, it was Stamfordham's correspondence, not George's voice, that carried the decisive weight. The courtier who left the paper trail became, in historical terms, the most consequential non-royal figure in the entire story. On the other side of the diplomatic divide stood Sir George Buchanan, British ambassador in Petrograd, the man closest to the speed and danger of events in Russia. Buchanan was a career diplomat, not a courtier, and he inhabited a different world from Stamfordham's. A world of dispatches from a capital in upheaval, of conversations with men who might be in government one week and in prison the next, of reading a revolution in real time while his instructions from London arrived with the comfortable delay of distance. He saw what the palace could not feel, that the situation on the ground was deteriorating faster than anyone in Whitehall or Buckingham Palace understood, that the window for getting the Romanovs out was narrow and closing with every week that passed, and that failure to act would carry consequences that no amount of later diplomatic language could soften. He had known the Romanovs personally. He had dined at their table. He understood that what was happening was not abstract. He was, in dramatic terms, the embodiment of the road not taken, the British representative who saw urgency firsthand and who could not make the people who mattered see it in time. The Russian political actors who briefly held the Romanovs' fate in their hands need to be understood, not as supporting figures, but as men trapped between forces they could not control. Pavel Milyukov, the liberal historian who served as foreign minister in Prince Lvov's provisional government from March to May 1917, wanted legality, parliamentary order, and Western respectability. He was the kind of Russian who believed the country could transition from autocracy to constitutional government without catastrophe, and he was proved wrong within months. Prince Lvov himself, the head of that same provisional government, was an aristocratic reformer who presided over a political authority that was already hollowed out by the power of the Petrograd Soviet, the Workers' and Soldiers' Council that represented a far more radical vision of Russia's future. Both men operated in the brief, fragile interval between the February Revolution and the Bolshevik seizure of power in October, the window in which exile for the Romanovs was still thinkable, still belonged to the realm of diplomacy rather than revolutionary violence. That window would prove far smaller than any of them imagined. And then there was Maria Feodorovna, Dagmar of Denmark, Nicholas's mother, the woman who connected the Romanov and British courts through the same Danish bloodline that had made George and Nicholas cousins. She had married into the Romanov dynasty in 1866, had borne Alexander III of 6 children, had known the glittering certainty of imperial Russia at its zenith, and was in her late 60s when the revolution came. She represented an older world, a world in which dynastic kinship was not merely symbolic but was understood as a genuine obligation, a safety mechanism woven into the very structure of European power. If your cousin was in danger, you took them in. If a throne fell, the family closed ranks. That was the code she had lived by. And her diary entries from the revolutionary months carry the bewilderment of a woman watching the assumptions of a lifetime dissolve. She would outlive her son, her daughter-in-law, and all 5 of her grandchildren. She would die in Denmark in 1928, having spent her final years refusing to believe that Nicholas and his family were truly dead, because to believe it was to accept that the world she had known and the obligations she had trusted had been entirely hollow. The children at the center of the story, Nicholas and Alexandra's 5, must be understood not as a collective symbol of innocence, but as 5 separate people whose individuality the public image of the Romanovs had systematically obscured. Alexei, the Tsarevich born in 1904, was the long-shadowed child, bright, lively when his health permitted, and burdened from birth by a condition that made every bruise a crisis and every day a negotiation between the boy's natural energy and his body's lethal fragility. The 4 daughters, Olga, born in 1895, Tatiana in 1897, Maria in 1899, and Anastasia in 1901, had been photographed endlessly, dressed in matching white, and presented to the public as a seamless portrait of imperial grace. Behind those photographs, each was distinct. Olga was introspective, emotionally sensitive, the most likely to chafe at the constraints of court life, and the one whose temperament suggested she might have thrived in a world that gave her choices. Tatiana was practical, organized, and the daughter who most resembled her mother in her instinct for managing a household under strain, the one who would hold things together when things began to fall apart. Maria was warm-hearted, physically strong, socially open in a way that the family's increasing isolation made difficult to express, and possessed of a gentleness that people remembered years after her death. Anastasia was the youngest, the most irrepressible, the family comedian whose energy and mischief would later be mythologized into a survival legend that said more about the world's need for a happy ending than it did about her actual life. They were raised under an unusually austere regime for children of their status. Plain rooms, cold baths, hand-me-down clothing, camp beds, a nursery discipline modeled more on English upper-class restraint than on the extravagance of the Russian court. That austerity was deliberate. It reflected Nicholas and Alexandra's genuine belief in domestic simplicity as a moral value, their desire to raise grounded children inside extraordinary privilege. And it created a family that was, within its own walls, remarkably close. The 4 sisters shared bedrooms in pairs, Olga with Tatiana, Maria with Anastasia, and signed joint letters with the acronym UTMA, the first letter of each name. They were, by every account, emotionally interdependent in a way that was both beautiful and limiting. The closer they clung to one another, the less they understood of the country outside the palace gates. The family's world shrank around them as political danger grew, and the warmth that sustained them inside that shrinking world was also the warmth that kept them from seeing clearly what was coming. Nicholas and Alexandra's marriage had begun in 1894 as a genuine love match, which in the context of royal alliances was unusual and, as it turned out, dangerous. They had met years earlier, when Alex was 12 and Nicholas 16, at the wedding of her elder sister Elizabeth, to Nicholas's uncle, Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich. The attraction had been immediate on Nicholas's side. He wrote in his diary that he dreamed of one day marrying Alex of Hesse. She resisted at first, troubled by the requirement to convert from Lutheranism to Russian Orthodoxy, a conversion that meant renouncing not just a denomination but an entire spiritual identity. She relented under the combined pressure of Nicholas's devotion, the dynastic expectation that a match of this caliber ought to proceed, and what appears to have been, in the end, genuine feeling. They married in November 1894, only weeks after the death of Alexander III, a wedding held in mourning, overshadowed by the old Tsar's funeral, which many later read as an omen. Love made them private, privacy made them insular, insularity made them blind. The household they built together was warm, devout, photographically picturesque, and almost entirely disconnected from the political machinery that was supposed to sustain them. They attended church together with a regularity that impressed even the devout Russian clergy. They read to one another in the evenings, Alexandra favoring devotional literature, Nicholas the diaries and memoirs of his ancestors. They fussed over Alexei with the anxious tenderness of parents who knew their child might not survive a stumble on a staircase. They took family holidays on the imperial yacht, the Standard cruising the Finnish archipelago in summers that photographs have preserved as idyllic, sunlight on the water, children playing on deck, a family that looked from the outside like the happiest in Europe. What nobody outside the innermost circle knew was the terror that accompanied every one of those holidays, the constant vigilance over Alexei, the hidden bruises that could become internal hemorrhages, the rushed summoning of doctors, the telegrams to Rasputin when medicine failed and faith was all that remained. And around them, the empire frayed. By 1909, when the family sailed to the Isle of Wight to visit George and his household during Cowes Week, the public image was still doing its work. On the visit was an occasion of considerable diplomatic and ceremonial weight. The imperial yacht Standard, escorted by warships, anchored off Cowes in early August. Nicholas wore a British admiral's uniform, a courtesy appointment that was, like everything in royal diplomacy, both personal and political. There were naval reviews, ceremonial salutes, military bands playing on the water. The two families dined together. Nicholas met with the Prime Minister, Herbert Asquith, and the Foreign Secretary, Sir Edward Grey. Alexandra was photographed with George's children. The spectators along the shore saw what spectators were meant to see: two branches of the same European royal family performing their kinship with pomp, warmth, and mutual confidence. The rituals of empire enacted in the style of a family reunion, it looked from every public angle like solidarity. What the photographs and the press coverage did not convey was the fragility beneath the surface. The Russian branch of the family was already hollowing out from the inside. The Tsar's authority resting on a political structure that had cracked in 1905 and never fully healed. Alexandra's unpopularity deepening with every year she spent in seclusion. Her reliance on Rasputin beginning to generate the kind of rumors that penetrated even the insulation of the imperial court. The child everyone smiled at in the photographs, Alexei, 5 years old at the time of the visit, cheerful and energetic in the brief windows when his condition allowed, carried in his blood a disorder that was slowly warping every decision his parents made. And behind the cordial meetings between George and Nicholas, there existed a growing asymmetry that neither man acknowledged publicly. George was learning to be a modern constitutional monarch, to manage, to defer, to calculate the mood of his country before making any move. Nicholas was still governing, as though divine right and personal loyalty were sufficient tools for the 20th century. The more serene the picture, the more fragile the reality behind it. That visit, its sunlit, ceremonial, full of silver and bunting and the comfortable fiction that royalty still functioned as a continental family, would be the last time the two branches of the tree stood together in anything resembling shared confidence. The Standard sailed home to Russia. The families exchanged letters. The photographs were filed. And the world that had made such visits possible, a world in which three emperors could be cousins, in which dynastic marriages were diplomatic instruments, in which the rituals of royalty could still paper over the cracks in the structures beneath them, had less than 5 years left. By 1914, that world was gone. The war that followed would consume 10 million lives, destroy 4 empires, and turn the comfortable certainties of the European royal network into a dark joke. Cousins who had dined together and reviewed one another's fleets found themselves on opposite sides of a catastrophe that made kinship irrelevant. And within a decade of that last glittering visit to Cowes, one of those families would be dead in a cellar in Yekaterinburg, and the other would be quietly rewriting its own history to explain why it had not done more. The war was coming, and neither the family tree, nor the family feeling, nor the photographs, nor the uniforms, nor the shared blood of Danish princesses would survive what it brought. If this story has you as captivated as I think it has, do subscribe. What happened next to this family is something the public never knew, and we're only just beginning. The war, when it came, did not arrive as a single thunderclap. It arrived as a sequence of diplomatic failures, mobilization schedules, and ultimatums that ground the old European order into the mud of Flanders and the frozen plains of the Eastern Front. An assassination in Sarajevo on June the 28th, 1914. The shooting of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria by a Bosnian Serb nationalist set off a chain of alliance obligations and military timetables that no government could stop and no monarch could override. On August the 1st, Germany declared war on Russia. 2 days later, Germany declared war on France. On August the 4th, Britain entered the conflict. Within a week, three of the continent's great empires, governed by men who were, in the language of royal kinship family, were at war with one another. Kaiser Wilhelm was George's first cousin on one side. Nicholas was George's first cousin on the other. The family tree that had looked like a safety net now looked like a trap. And the comfortable assumption that shared blood meant shared interest, that the cousins who had dined together and reviewed one another's navies would, when it mattered, find a way to prevent catastrophe, was revealed as perhaps the most dangerous illusion in European politics. But before the war consumed everything, there had been years that deserved to be called good, or at least years that looked good, which in the world of monarchy amounted to much the same thing. The Romanov family in the years between 1905 and 1914 existed in a peculiar condition, publicly magnificent, privately fragile, and sustained by a visual culture that made them, for a brief period, one of the most recognized families on earth. Nicholas and Alexandra had retreated increasingly from the formal life of the Petersburg court to the relative intimacy of the Alexander Palace at Tsarskoye Selo, 15 miles south of the capital, where they built a domestic world that was both a sanctuary and a prison. The Alexander Palace was not the Winter Palace. It was smaller, more manageable, surrounded by parkland and guarded perimeters. It was the house where the children grew up, where family meals happened at regular hours, where Nicholas could pretend, for a few hours each day, that he was an ordinary father rather than the autocrat of all the Russias. The daughters were central to the mythology of those years, and it is worth pausing to understand why, because the way the public saw them then shaped the way the world mourned them later. Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia were photographed with an intensity that no previous generation of royal children had experienced. The new technologies of the early 20th century, inexpensive reproduction, illustrated magazines, picture postcards, turned them into public figures before any of them was old enough to understand what that meant. They appeared in official portraits, four girls in white dresses, hair ribboned, expressions carefully composed, arranged in the order of their birth like a visual proof of dynastic continuity. They appeared in informal snapshots taken by their parents, who were enthusiastic amateur photographers. Images that showed a more natural, playful family life, and that were, in their own way, as carefully curated as the formal ones. The public saw grace, youth, beauty, and domestic harmony. What the public did not see was what lay beneath: the anxiety over Alexei that colored every family decision, the mother whose intensity was tipping toward obsession, the father whose political world was crumbling while his domestic world remained, in its insular way, intact. Each daughter's birth had carried a specific political weight that the smiling photographs never acknowledged. Olga, the first in 1895, a girl, not the heir the dynasty needed. The court celebrated politely. The whispers began. Tatiana II in 1897, another girl, and the whispers grew louder. The question of the succession was not merely a family matter in Russia. It was a constitutional crisis in embryo, because the succession laws of the empire demanded a male heir. Maria, the third, in 1899, and by now the court's disappointment had hardened into something closer to judgment. Alexandra felt it. She absorbed the blame that the court's social conventions directed at the mother rather than the father, and the pressure fed her anxiety, her sense of persecution, and her conviction that the world outside the family was hostile. Anastasia IV in 1901, and the absence of a son was no longer a matter of quiet concern but of open dynastic alarm. It was only with Alexei's birth in August 1904 that the succession crisis appeared to resolve itself. The relief was enormous. The celebrations were imperial in scale. A 101-gun salute, Te Deums in the cathedrals, public rejoicing across the empire. And the discovery, within weeks, that the infant Tsarevich suffered from hemophilia turned that relief into a private catastrophe that the family would spend the next 14 years trying to conceal. The best years then were never as stable as they appeared. They were years of managed surfaces. The family attended church with visible devotion, the Orthodox liturgy, with its incense and icons and ancient choral music, providing a structure of meaning that Nicholas and Alexandra needed as much as they believed in. They sailed on the Standard each summer, the children swimming in the cold waters of the Finnish archipelago, the parents reading on deck, the imperial standard flying from the mast. They retreated to the Ipatiev Palace in Crimea, where the climate was warmer and the family could walk in the gardens and picnic on the hillside and pretend for a few weeks that the pressures of the empire existed somewhere else. Nicholas attended to state business with the conscientiousness of a man who believed duty was a form of prayer, reading dispatches, receiving ministers, signing documents. But he did so with a passivity that frustrated everyone who worked with him. He did not lead, he endured. He waited for problems to resolve themselves, and when they did not, he deferred to Alexandra's certainty or to the counsel of whoever had spoken to him last. Alexandra supervised the children's education with a rigor that reflected her own upbringing in the household of Queen Victoria. Cold baths in the morning, simple food, limited pocket money, an emphasis on practical skills and moral seriousness that sat oddly inside the most lavish court in Europe. The daughters learned languages, Russian, English, French, and some German. They played the piano. They did needlework. They kept diaries. And they were largely shielded from the political reality of the country their father governed. Their world was the Alexander Palace, the Standard, the Levadia, the hospital wards they would later work in, and one another. They knew their father was the Tsar. They did not fully grasp what that meant or what it would cost. There is something about that domestic world, its warmth, its sincerity, its deliberate smallness inside the immensity of the Russian Empire that has to be understood before the destruction makes sense. These were not people playing at family. They were a family genuinely close, genuinely devoted to one another, genuinely happiest when the doors were closed and the officials were elsewhere and the children could be loud and ordinary without the weight of empire pressing down on the room. Nicholas played with his children in the park. He carried Alexei when the boy could not walk. He told bedtime stories. Alexandra, for all her anxieties and her rigidity and her gathering obsessions, loved her daughters with a fierce, consuming tenderness that they returned in full. The girls called their parents Papa and Mama in their letters with an affection that was not performed for the public. It was real. And that sincerity was part of what destroyed them, because a family that organizes itself around privacy, emotional retreat, and the concealment of its most important secret cannot also govern an empire that demands transparency, political flexibility, and the ability to read the mood of 170 million people. The virtues that made them a good family made them a catastrophic dynasty. That paradox is the heart of the story. The cracks, when they became visible, did not arrive as scandal. They arrived as war. The First World War did to the Romanov system what a sustained frost does to a building with hidden structural damage. It found every weakness and made it fatal. Russia entered the war in August 1914 with an army that was vast in numbers and catastrophically deficient in equipment, leadership, and logistical capacity. The mobilization itself had been a feat of sheer scale. Millions of men called up from farms and factories across the empire's 11 time zones. But the army they formed was short of rifles, short of ammunition, short of competent officers, and commanded by a general staff whose planning bore little relationship to the realities of modern industrialized warfare. The early months brought some successes against Austria-Hungary and Galicia, but the German army inflicted defeats so severe. Tannenberg in August, where an entire Russian army was encircled and destroyed, and the Masurian Lakes in September, that the illusion of Russian military competence was shattered before the first winter. Casualties mounted in numbers that staggered even a country accustomed to the scale of its own suffering. By the end of 1915, Russia had lost close to 4 million men, killed, wounded, or captured, and the home front was beginning to fracture under the weight of food shortages, inflation, a collapsing railway system, and a government that seemed incapable of organizing a war effort on the scale the conflict demanded. Nicholas made the decision that sealed his fate in September 1915, when he assumed personal command of the Russian armies at Stavka, the military headquarters in Mogilev. It was a decision born of the same conviction that had governed his entire reign, that the Tsar's authority was personal, sacred, and could not be delegated without betrayal. His ministers begged him not to go. 8 members of his own cabinet signed a letter warning him that the move would be catastrophic. He went anyway. By taking command, he believed he was fulfilling his highest duty, placing himself at the head of his army in the nation's hour of greatest need. What he actually did was make himself personally responsible for every subsequent military failure and, more dangerously still, leave the governance of the home front to Alexandra and the ministers she trusted, which in practice meant governance increasingly shaped by the advice of Grigory Rasputin. The Siberian mystic's hold on Alexandra was by now an open secret in the capital, and it was corroding the dynasty's remaining credibility with a speed that nothing could arrest. Rasputin advised on ministerial appointments. He offered opinions on military strategy. He predicted the outcomes of battles with the serene confidence of a man who believed his spiritual authority outranked the expertise of generals. Alexandra, who trusted him absolutely, because he had eased Alexei's suffering when doctors could not, and because she needed to believe that God had placed a holy man beside her family for a purpose, relayed his counsel to Nicholas in letters that mixed endearment, political instruction, and spiritual exhortation in equal measure. Ministers were appointed and dismissed at bewildering speed, often on Rasputin's recommendation. Competent administrators were replaced by compliant ones. The phrase ministerial leapfrog entered the political vocabulary of Petrograd, and with it came a spreading contempt for the throne that was rapidly becoming irreversible. The machinery of government, already strained beyond its capacity by the demands of total war, began to grind toward dysfunction and then toward collapse. For the daughters, the war years brought a transformation that the pre-war photographs had not prepared anyone to expect. Olga and Tatiana, the two eldest, trained as Red Cross nurses and worked in a military hospital established in the grounds of the Catherine Palace at Tsarskoye Selo, tending to soldiers wounded at the front. The work was physically demanding, emotionally harrowing, and for young women raised inside the insulation of the imperial court, a confrontation with a Russia they had never been permitted to see. They changed bandages on men whose bodies had been destroyed by artillery. They assisted in surgeries. They held the hands of soldiers who were dying in their beds, boys not much older than they were, from villages and farms whose names the grand duchesses had never heard spoken. Olga, who was 19 when the war began, found the work overwhelming at times, and she was too emotionally porous, too prone to absorbing the suffering around her, and was eventually moved to administrative duties in the hospital. She did not stop visiting the wards. She simply could not bear the surgical theater. Tatiana, 17, proved steadier and more capable, assisting the surgeons with a composure that impressed the medical staff and that reflected her practical temperament, the same temperament that would sustain her, in a different way, during the far worse years to come. Maria and Anastasia, too young for formal nursing duties, visited the hospital wards regularly, brought cigarettes and small gifts to the patients, read to them, wrote letters home on their behalf, and tried to cheer the wounded with their presence. The family was doing what it believed it should, serving, enduring, showing solidarity with the suffering of the nation. And there was genuine feeling behind it. The girls were not performing charity for the cameras. They cared about the men they tended, remembered their names, followed their recoveries, mourned their deaths. But the nation, by 1916, was past the point where royal gestures could compensate for political failure. The contrast between the daughters' sincere hospital work and their mother's deepening entanglement with Rasputin was, for anyone who could see both, a portrait of a family pulling in opposite directions. The younger generation reaching outward toward the real Russia, the older generation retreating further into mysticism, suspicion, and denial. Rasputin was murdered on the night of December the 30th, 1916, killed at the Ipatiev Palace on the Moika Canal in Petrograd by a group of conspirators led by Prince Felix Yusupov and Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, who believed they were saving the dynasty by removing its most damaging association. The murder was lurid, poison cakes that failed to work, gunshots, a body beaten and then dumped through a hole in the ice of the frozen Neva, and it became almost immediately the stuff of legend and exaggeration. But if the conspirators believed that Rasputin's death would stabilize the throne, they were profoundly wrong. The damage was already too deep. Alexandra, devastated by the loss of the man she believed God had sent to protect her son, withdrew further into grief, certainty, and a sense of persecution that now extended to the Russian aristocracy itself. Nicholas at the front returned briefly to comfort her and then went back to Stavka, increasingly isolated from the political reality of his own capital, increasingly dependent on dispatches that told him what his subordinates thought he wanted to hear. And in Petrograd, renamed from the German-sounding St. Petersburg at the start of the war, in a gesture of nationalist feeling that the imperial family had endorsed without understanding what it signified. Bread queues were lengthening, strikes were spreading, and the army garrison that was supposed to maintain order was filled with conscripts and reservists who had far more sympathy with the workers than with the regime that had sent their brothers to die. The February Revolution began on the 8th of March, 1917, the 23rd of February by the Julian calendar, still in use in Russia, with women textile workers taking to the streets of Petrograd to demand bread. It was International Women's Day, and the initial demonstrations had the character of a protest rather than an insurrection. But the protests swelled. Factories joined, students joined. By the second day, the demonstrations had become a general strike. Soldiers from the Petrograd garrison were ordered to disperse the crowds, and on the third day, some units opened fire, killing dozens. But by the fourth day, the calculus had reversed. Regiment after regiment refused to shoot, and some turned their rifles on their own officers and joined the crowds in the streets. The Duma, which Nicholas had ordered prorogued, formed a provisional committee to attempt to restore order. The Petrograd Soviet, the Workers' and Soldiers' Council, reconstituted itself as a rival center of authority. The city was lost. And Nicholas, who was at military headquarters in Mogilev, 600 miles from the capital, found himself receiving reports of a situation that was already beyond anyone's control before he fully understood it had begun. His train was diverted. His telegrams went unanswered. The isolation of the autocrat, the man who had insisted on personal command, who had believed that his presence at the front was what duty demanded, was total. On March the 15th, 1917, at a railway siding near the city of Pskov, Nicholas II signed the instrument of abdication. The scene was as far from the grandeur of the Romanov court as it was possible to imagine. A railway carriage, a desk, two representatives of the Duma, Alexander Guchkov and Vasily Shulgin, who had traveled from Petrograd to receive the document. Nicholas had been advised by his generals, one after another, that the army could no longer guarantee order, that the capital was in the hands of the revolution, and that abdication was the only way to prevent civil war. He had held on for days, hoping the situation would stabilize, ordering troop movements that were never carried out, sending telegrams that went unanswered. The isolation of the Supreme Commander, 600 miles from his capital, surrounded by military staff who had already concluded that the regime was finished, was total. He abdicated first in favor of his son Alexei. Then in the same hour he changed his mind, realizing that he could not bear to be separated from the boy, and knowing that Alexei's hemophilia would make any reign a perpetual medical crisis governed by regents and doctors. He abdicated instead in favor of his younger brother, Grand Duke Michael. The following day, Michael, confronted with the reality that no institution in Russia could guarantee his safety or his authority, declined the crown. 304 years of Romanov rule ended not with a battle or a siege, but with a signature in a railway carriage, a succession that simply stopped. And a man who recorded the event in his diary with the same methodical brevity he applied to everything else in his life. He noted the weather. He noted the time. He noted that he had slept well the night before. The disconnect between the magnitude of what had happened and the composure with which he recorded it tells you everything you need to know about Nicholas II, a man who maintained the habits of order even as his world came apart, and who never fully understood the scale of the thing he had lost until it was far too late to recover it. The narration should slow here, because what happened next is the hinge on which the entire documentary turns. On March the 23rd, 1917, 8 days after Nicholas's abdication, Sir George Buchanan, the British ambassador in Petrograd, delivered a message to Pavel Milyukov, the foreign minister of the new provisional government. The message stated that the King and His Majesty's government were prepared to offer the Emperor and his family refuge in England for the duration of the war. Buchanan pressed the point with urgency. He warned that if anything terrible should happen to the imperial family, the provisional government would be discredited in the eyes of the civilized world. The offer was real. It was on the record. And it represented, for a brief moment, exactly what the old dynastic logic of European royalty was supposed to produce. A cousin in danger, a cousin with the means to help, and a door held open. The door stayed open for approximately 2 weeks. By early April, the mood inside Buckingham Palace had shifted. Lord Stamfordham, George's private secretary, began writing to Arthur Balfour, the foreign secretary, with a message that was polite in form and devastating in substance. The king, Stamfordham reported, was becoming more concerned about the proposal to bring the Romanovs to England. Letters were arriving from people of all classes, working men, labor members of parliament, expressing hostile opinions about the idea of offering asylum to the former Tsar. Stamfordham asked whether it might be possible to suggest to Buchanan that he encouraged the Russian government to make some other arrangement for the imperial family's future residence. The language was diplomatic, the meaning was not. The palace was withdrawing. There is something about the mechanics of that withdrawal that is worth sitting with for a moment. It was not a dramatic confrontation. There was no shouting match in the cabinet room, no crisis meeting, no public declaration. It was a series of letters, written in the measured prose of courtiers and civil servants, each one moving the question of asylum a little further from possibility and a little closer to abandonment. Stamfordham wrote to Balfour on April the 6th. He wrote again on April the 8th, this time more pointedly, reporting that the king's concerns had deepened, that the subject was being discussed in all kinds of circles, and that it would be best if the suggestion for asylum could be quietly dropped. The palace did not say no in so many words. It said that perhaps another country might be more suitable, Denmark perhaps, or France. It said that the king was concerned about the effect on public opinion at a moment when the country was already strained by 3 years of war. It said that the timing was difficult. It said, in the bureaucratic language of people who have learned to refuse without appearing to refuse, that the door was better left closed, and that the closing of the door should, if at all possible, be attributed to someone other than the king. That last point was crucial, and it would shape the official narrative for decades. The palace wanted the refusal to look like a government decision, not a royal one. And because the communication was handled through private channels, Stamfordham to Balfour, the palace to the Foreign Office, not a word of it in the press or the public record, the refusal left almost no visible trace. For more than 60 years, the official history of the British monarchy maintained that it was Lloyd George's government that had withdrawn the asylum offer. It was not until the 1980s, when scholars gained access to royal archives and private correspondence, that the palace's central role in the withdrawal became unmistakable. The immediate consequences radiated in every direction, though not all of them were visible at the time. Nicholas and Alexandra, held under guard at the Alexander Palace at Tsarskoye Selo, did not know that the offer had been made and withdrawn. They waited, as families in crisis wait, for news that did not come. Nicholas tending the palace gardens, Alexandra nursing Alexei through a bout of measles that had also struck the daughters, both of them sustained by the belief that arrangements were being made, that someone somewhere in the network of royal cousins and diplomatic connections was working to get them out. That belief was not unreasonable. It was the logical expectation of people who had spent their entire lives inside a system where kinship and diplomatic channels were supposed to function. What they did not know was that the most important channel, the one that ran through Buckingham Palace, had already been shut down by the people closest to the cousin they trusted most. Buchanan, in Petrograd, had seen the urgency and communicated it with the clarity of a man who understood that days mattered, that the political ground was shifting beneath the provisional government, and that every week of delay reduced the chances of a safe departure. But he could not override the instructions of his own government, and his own government was receiving pressure from the palace to let the matter drop. The ambassador found himself in the position of a man who had sounded the alarm and then watched the fire service decline to respond. He would spend the rest of his career carrying the knowledge that the warning had been heard and ignored. Milyukov, who had been willing to facilitate the family's departure, who understood that the presence of the former Tsar on Russian soil was a problem that would only grow more dangerous with time, found himself managing a provisional government that was losing authority by the week. The Petrograd Soviet, which held effective veto power over the government's decisions, was hostile to any arrangement that looked like privileged treatment for the former autocrat. The moderate liberals who had hoped to manage the transition from Tsarism to parliamentary government discovered that moderation was a currency that was rapidly losing its value in revolutionary Russia. The window for action was not merely narrowing, it was closing with a speed that made the measured correspondence between London and Petrograd feel like men exchanging letters while a building burned. And George V, the cousin, the man whose face looked so much like Nicholas's that photographs confused them, the man who had dined with the Romanovs at Cowes and reviewed their navy and exchanged letters addressed "Dearest Nicky," moved or allowed his household to move toward the position that the British monarchy would occupy for the rest of the story. Institutional self-preservation above all else. The same king who would in July of that year formally rename his dynasty the House of Windsor, dropping the German Saxe-Coburg-Gotha in a calculated act of wartime rebranding that traded ancestral identity for public acceptability, had already demonstrated in the quiet withdrawal of the asylum offer the principle that would define his reign and his legacy. Survival meant adaptation. Adaptation meant knowing when sentiment was a luxury the institution could not afford. And in the spring of 1917, with the British public exhausted by war, suspicious of foreign entanglements, and increasingly hostile to anything that smelled of autocratic privilege, the sentiment of cousinly obligation was exactly the kind of luxury that George's household had decided to discard. The British monarchy did not simply fail to rescue the Romanovs later, when the chaos of revolution and civil war made rescue impossible. It first offered to take them in, and then it drew back and quietly, administratively, through the genteel machinery of courtiers and private letters. At the one moment when departure from Russia was still thinkable, still belonged to the realm of policy rather than fantasy. That is the fact the documentary must hold in the air as the story moves forward. Not because it is the whole explanation for what followed. It is not, and the documentary must resist the temptation to make it so. But because it is the part of the explanation that the palace spent the longest trying to make disappear. And now the question that pulls everything forward was the withdrawal of asylum what doomed the Romanovs? Or was history already moving too fast, in too many directions, for any single letter from London to have saved them? The answer, as it turns out, is more complicated and more damning than either version suggests. The simplest version of this story, the version that fits on a postcard, the version that makes for a clean accusation, is that George Thefaive abandoned his cousin and the Romanovs died because of it. It has the shape of a parable, the cowardly king, the doomed family, the letter that could have saved them. But the simplest version is not the true one, and the documentary must resist it even as it holds the palace accountable for what it did. Because the truth is that the Romanovs' fate was not sealed by a single decision in London. It was sealed by a convergence of forces, some British, some Russian, some structural, some personal, that closed around the family from every direction at once. Helen Rappaport, the historian who has studied the rescue question more carefully than almost anyone, put it plainly. It was not ever a simple case of one British king losing his nerve. That sentence is essential to the documentary's credibility. Britain mattered. George mattered. But so did the Petrograd Soviet, the speed of Russian radicalization, the physical difficulty of moving a family across a country in revolution, and the disintegrating authority of the very government that was supposed to keep them safe. The weeks following the withdrawal of the British asylum offer did not produce an immediate catastrophe. They produced something worse, a slow, incremental narrowing of possibility that was all the more devastating for being invisible to the family at its center. The Romanovs remained at Tsarskoye Selo through the spring and summer of 1917, confined to the Alexander Palace under the guard of soldiers whose attitudes ranged from correct to contemptuous. The palace that had been their sanctuary was now their prison, and the transformation was registered in 1,000 small humiliations that accumulated like sediment. The family was restricted to a handful of rooms. Their walks in the grounds were supervised in time. Servants who had attended them for years were dismissed or chose to leave. The china they ate from was still imperial, but the food was increasingly plain. Provisions supplied by a revolutionary government that was not inclined to feed its most conspicuous prisoners lavishly. Guards lounged in rooms that had once been reserved for ministers. Some of them were respectful, others were not. One early indignity, small in itself but symbolic of everything that had changed, was the confiscation of Nicholas's personal sidearm, the officer's revolver he had carried as a matter of habit and identity. He was no longer a commander. He was not even, in the eyes of the new order, a gentleman. He was citizen Romanov. Nicholas, stripped of his title and his authority, settled into a routine that saw everything about his temperament and nothing about his understanding of the danger he was in. He walked in the palace grounds, sometimes alone, sometimes with his children. He sawed wood, an activity that became, in the eyes of the guards, and later in the retelling, both a symbol of his ordinariness and of his bewilderment, a former emperor performing manual labor as though the problem were merely one of filling time. He read extensively in the history, memoirs, English novels. He played with Alexei when the boy's health allowed it. He recorded the weather in his diary with the same meticulous care he had brought to every entry since his youth. He did not rage against the revolution. He did not plot his escape. He did not, so far as the record shows, fully grasp that the political forces that had taken his throne were not the kind that could be waited out. He behaved as he had always behaved, with a composure that looked like dignity from one angle and like incomprehension from another. The man who had governed an empire by assuming that duty and patience were sufficient had not changed his character. The only thing that had changed was that the world no longer rewarded those qualities. Alexandra, by contrast, did not settle. She wrote letters to friends, to relatives, to anyone she believed might still be able to help, in a hand that grew more urgent and more mystical as the months passed. She prayed with an intensity that the servants and guards found unsettling, spending hours before the icons she had brought with her, kneeling on a floor that was no longer the polished parquet of a palace chapel, but the plain boards of a guarded residence. She clung to her children with a fierceness that was both maternal and imperial, as though physical proximity could substitute for the political protection that had been withdrawn. She supervised their lessons. She inspected their clothing. She maintained the routines of a household that no longer existed in any recognizable form, because routine was the last thing she could control. She refused to believe that the situation was permanent. God would not permit it. The family had been tested before, by Alexei's illness, by the war, by Rasputin's murder, and had survived. Survival through faith was the only logic she understood, and she applied it now with the same ferocious certainty she had applied to every crisis of the preceding 2 decades. The difference was that faith, in this instance, was not a coping strategy. It was a blindfold, and the world she could not see was moving faster and more violently than anything her prayers could address. The daughters adapted with the resilience of young women who had already spent 3 years working in wartime hospitals and who understood, better than either of their parents, that the world outside the palace walls had changed in ways that could not be prayed away. Olga, at 21, was old enough to grasp the political danger and young enough to still hope that something would intervene. Tatiana, at 19, managed the household with the same practical competence she had brought to the surgical wards, organizing routines, comforting her mother, keeping the younger girls occupied. Maria, at 17, maintained her warmth and her sociability even under guard, striking up conversations with soldiers that alarmed her mother and that revealed a capacity for human connection that the family's insularity had never entirely suppressed. Anastasia, at 15, was the most outwardly defiant, mocking the guards, refusing to be solemn, channeling her anxiety into the same irrepressible energy that had defined her since childhood. And Alexei, 12 years old, was both the most protected member of the family and the most vulnerable. His hemophilia, a constant negotiation between the boy's desire to be active and the medical reality that any injury could become a crisis. The provisional government, meanwhile, was failing. And its failure was not the dramatic, cinematic kind that makes for clean narrative, but the grinding, incremental kind that makes governments irrelevant before anyone quite notices they have lost control. Prince Lvov, the aristocratic liberal who had headed the government since March, resigned in July 1917 after the disastrous July Days, a period of street violence and political upheaval in Petrograd that exposed the government's inability to maintain order or to satisfy the demands of a population that wanted peace, land, and an end to the war that was still consuming Russian lives on the Eastern Front. Lvov was replaced by Alexander Kerensky, a lawyer and moderate socialist who was the most dynamic figure in the provisional government. Theatrical, impassioned, capable of stirring rhetoric, and fatally convinced that the force of his own personality could hold together a country that was splitting along class, political, and military lines that no single leader could bridge. Kerensky understood, more clearly than Lvov had, that the Romanovs were a danger to themselves and to the government that held them. Their presence near the capital was a provocation to the radical left, which saw in the former Tsar a symbol of everything the revolution had been made to destroy, and a temptation to the monarchist right, which might use the family as a rallying point for counter-revolution. The Petrograd Soviet, the real power in the capital, was moving steadily leftward under Bolshevik influence. The Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, who had returned from exile in Switzerland in April, transported across Germany in a sealed railway car in one of the most consequential gambles of the entire war, were gaining support among workers and soldiers with a program that was brutally simple: peace, land, bread, and all power to the Soviets. Against that program, the provisional government's appeals to order, legality, and continued participation in the war sounded increasingly like the pronouncements of men who had mistaken their own hopes for the country's reality. Kerensky made the decision in August 1917 to move the Romanovs out of Tsarskoye Selo. The destination was Tobolsk, a small remote town in western Siberia, chosen, Kerensky later claimed, because it was far from the political volatility of Petrograd and Moscow, because its isolation would make both rescue and attack more difficult, and because the local population was thought to be politically moderate. Whether Kerensky genuinely believed that distance would protect the family, or whether he was simply moving a problem he could not solve to a place where it would be less visible, remains one of the unanswerable questions of the story. The journey itself was a logistical exercise in diminished status. The family traveled by special train, the blinds drawn, the imperial insignia removed from the carriages going to Tumen, and from there by river steamer down the Irtish and the Tobol to the town itself. They were accompanied by guards, a handful of loyal servants and attendants who had chosen to follow them into exile, and what luggage they had been permitted to bring. They were no longer living in a palace. They were living in the former governor's house in a provincial town of wooden buildings, unpaved streets, and a population that regarded them with a mixture of curiosity, sympathy, and suspicion. Tobolsk was a kind of limbo, neither freedom nor the worst kind of captivity, but something in between that wore the family down through sheer indefiniteness. The governor's house was reasonably comfortable by provincial standards, but cramped for a family accustomed to the spaces of an imperial residence. They had rooms. They had some of their belongings: books, icons, photographs, a few pieces of furniture that had traveled with them from Tsarskoye Selo. They had one another. Nicholas continued his diary, recording the temperature, the weather, the books he was reading, the small events of a confined life, with the same methodical calm he had brought to every entry since adolescence. Alexandra continued her letters and her prayers, writing to friends and family in a tone that alternated between piety, defiance, and a brittle optimism that grew harder to sustain as the months passed and no rescue came. The children put on amateur theatricals, small performances staged in the drawing room of the governor's house, the kind of family entertainment that they had enjoyed at Tsarskoye Selo and that now, in the context of Siberian exile, carried an undertone of desperate normality that must have been apparent to everyone in the room, even if no one acknowledged it aloud. Olga and Tatiana read. Maria chatted with the guards, a habit that her mother found improper and that Maria could not or would not suppress, because human connection was as necessary to her as prayer was to Alexandra. Anastasia made everyone laugh. Alexei, whose health fluctuated with the unpredictability that had defined his entire life, had good days and bad days, and on the good days he played in the yard with the spaniel Joy, and on the bad days he lay in bed while his parents sat beside him with the old, familiar terror that never fully went away, even after 14 years of living with it. The Siberian winter closed over Tobolsk with a severity that the family, accustomed to the milder climate of the Baltic coast and Crimea, found punishing. Temperatures dropped to 30 and 40 degrees below zero. The rooms were heated by wood stoves that could not entirely defeat the cold. The family wrapped themselves in whatever warm clothing they possessed and huddled together in the evenings, reading aloud to one another while the wind drove snow against the windows. It was, in its own terrible way, the most concentrated version of the family life they had always wanted. Intimate, enclosed, dependent on nothing but one another, and the fact that it was also a prison only made the tenderness more desperate and more real. But Tobolsk was not safety. It was merely distance from the immediate danger, and that distance was shrinking with every shift in the political weather. Through the autumn and winter of 1917 into 1918, the political situation in Russia underwent a transformation so total that the very category of exile, with its implication of a stable government overseeing a defined legal status, lost its meaning. On November the 7th, 1917, October the 25th by the Julian calendar that Russia still used, which is why history calls it the October Revolution, the Bolsheviks seized power in Petrograd. The seizure was not a mass uprising in the manner of February. It was a calculated strike, planned by Lenin and executed by the Military Revolutionary Committee under Leon Trotsky. Bolshevik Red Guards and sympathetic soldiers took control of telegraph offices, railway stations, bridges, and government buildings in a series of coordinated actions that met almost no resistance. The cruiser Aurora, anchored in the Neva, fired a blank shell that served as a signal for the storming of the Winter Palace, a storming that was less dramatic than later Soviet mythology would make it, involving more confusion than heroism and more walking through unguarded doors than breaking them down. Kerensky fled the capital in a car borrowed from the American embassy. The provisional government, which had never possessed real authority and had spent its final weeks governing from rooms in the Winter Palace that still smelled of the Romanovs' furniture, ceased to exist overnight. In its place stood a revolutionary regime led by men who had no interest in constitutional niceties, no respect for the diplomatic conventions that had governed the Romanov question under Lvov and Kerensky, and no reason, ideological, political, or sentimental, to preserve the former imperial family alive if preserving them became inconvenient. This is the second fracture, and the documentary must treat it as the moment when the Romanovs passed from one kind of danger into another, qualitatively different kind. Under the provisional government, the family had been prisoners of a state that was weak, uncertain, and still operating within a framework, however attenuated in of legality and diplomatic accountability. The provisional government had communicated with foreign ambassadors. It had discussed the family's status with Britain and other allied powers. It had treated Nicholas, however reluctantly, as a political problem that required a political solution. Under the Bolsheviks, the calculus was entirely different. The new regime regarded legality as a bourgeois fiction. It viewed the former czar not as a diplomatic complication, but as a class enemy, the living embodiment of the system the revolution existed to destroy. And it was building its authority on the explicit repudiation of everything the Romanov dynasty had represented: autocracy, privilege, the divine right of sovereigns, the inherited wealth of a ruling class that the Bolsheviks intended to liquidate in every sense of the word. The family did not change. Their captivity did not initially change in its outward form, but the political logic surrounding them changed utterly, and with it the odds of their survival dropped from uncertain to vanishing. The months that followed the October Revolution saw the new Bolshevik government consumed by the task of consolidating power on a dozen fronts simultaneously. Negotiating the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany, which imposed devastating territorial losses on Russia in exchange for an end to the war, suppressing political opponents, establishing the Cheka, the secret police that would become the revolution's instrument of domestic terror, and fighting the opening engagements of what would become the Russian Civil War, a conflict between the Bolshevik Red Army and the loosely organized white forces. Monarchists, liberals, foreign interventionists, and everyone else who opposed Bolshevik rule that would consume Russia for the next 3 years. The Romanovs in Tobolsk were not yet a priority for Moscow, but they were not forgotten. Local Soviets in Western Siberia, more radical and less restrained than the central government, began to take an interest in the imperial family's captivity. The guards at the governor's house changed. The new ones were less professional, more ideologically motivated, and less inclined to treat the family with the residual courtesy that earlier soldiers had maintained. Restrictions tightened, rations diminished. The family's remaining servants and attendants were reduced in number. The noose was not yet tight, but it was being drawn, and the hands drawing it belonged to men who had no sentimental attachment to the conventions of the old world. And while the Romanovs' world contracted, the other branch of the family tree, some the British one, was executing the most consequential act of institutional self-preservation in its modern history. On July the 17th, 1917, almost exactly 1 year before the date that would acquire very different significance in Yekaterinburg, George V formally adopted the name Windsor for the British royal house. The old name, Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, was discarded. It was German, it was foreign, and it was in the context of a war in which German Zeppelins were bombing London streets and German submarines were sinking British merchantmen in the Atlantic, a liability that the monarchy could no longer afford. The decision had been debated for months within the palace, with Stamfordham canvassing options, Plantagenet, York, Lancaster, Fitzroy, Tudor, Stuart, before settling on Windsor, a name that carried the weight of the castle, the town, the Thameside landscape of English pageantry. The choice was inspired. Windsor sounded as though it had always belonged to the monarchy, as though the dynasty had been English all along rather than a branch of a German ducal family that had arrived on the British throne barely 2 centuries earlier through the vagaries of the Hanoverian succession. The renaming was announced to the public on July the 17th, with a proclamation in the London Gazette and a Privy Council order, and it was received by the British press and public with a satisfaction that confirmed what the palace had already understood: that in wartime, nationality trumped genealogy, and that the British people wanted a monarchy that felt like theirs. The German relatives were appalled. Kaiser Wilhelm, with the kind of sardonic wit that characterized his more perceptive moments, reportedly joked that he was looking forward to attending a performance of the Mezzo, the Merry Wives of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. But the joke was on the old order, not on George. The renaming was not merely cosmetic. It was a declaration of principle that the British monarchy existed as a national institution not a dynastic one, and that when the demands of nationality and the claims of dynasty came into conflict, nationality would win. The Romanovs were the living proof of what happened when a monarchy could not make that adjustment, when it clung to the old logic of sacred authority, family prerogative, and the assumption that the name on the door mattered less than the bloodline behind it. George's genius, or his household's genius, since it is impossible to know how much of the strategy was the king's own and how much was Stamfordham's, was to understand that the old model of monarchy as an international family business was finished, that the monarchies which survived the 20th century would be the ones that reinvented themselves as embodiments of national identity rather than participants in a transnational royal network. The name change cost nothing but sentiment. And sentiment, as the Spring's correspondence about asylum had already demonstrated, was a currency the palace had decided it could no longer afford. The contrast between the two cousins' trajectories in the second half of 1917 and the first half of 1918 is the documentary's sharpest structural tool, and it should be used deliberately, not as a polemical device, but as a means of making the viewer feel the moral weight of what institutional survival actually costs. In July 1917, George becomes a Windsor. In August, Nicholas becomes an exile in Siberia. George is pruning his family tree to make it look English. Nicholas is watching his family tree being cut down around him. George is managing public opinion through controlled symbolic gestures that cost him nothing but his German-sounding name. Nicholas has nothing left to manage. No public, no opinion, no gestures that anyone would receive. One cousin is editing his dynasty for survival. The other is being edited out of history. And the children, George's children safe in their nurseries, Nicholas's children confined to rooms with whitewashed windows, are inheriting the consequences of choices made above them, as children in these stories always do. The daughters, in the months between Tobolsk and Yekaterinburg, continued to live inside that narrowing space with a composure that the surviving letters and diaries reveal as both extraordinary and heartbreaking. They wrote to friends when they were permitted to. They sewed, not as a pastime, but as a necessity, mending clothes that could no longer be replaced. They read novels, passing books between them. They quarreled with one another in the way that sisters quarrel when confined to small rooms with no prospect of privacy or escape. Petty irritations flaring and subsiding within the same afternoon. Apologies offered and accepted with the speed of people who know they have no one else. They worried about their parents. They worried about Alexei. They worried in the way that young women worry when the future has become entirely unreadable, about what was going to happen to them. Not in the abstract philosophical sense, but in the immediate practical sense of whether they would be moved again, whether they would be separated, whether the guards who watched them now would be replaced by guards who were worse. Olga, who had always been the most emotionally transparent of the four, grew quieter and more withdrawn as the months of captivity accumulated. She was 22 by the spring of 1918, old enough to have married, old enough to understand the political forces arrayed against her family, and old enough to grieve for a future that she could see closing in front of her. Tatiana held the household together with the same organizational instinct that had sustained her in the wartime hospital wards, managing routines, mediating between her parents, ensuring that meals happened and clothes were washed and the family's daily life maintained some structure, even as the structure of their world disintegrated. She was the daughter who bore the most practical weight, and she bore it without complaint because that was who she was. Maria, whose warmth made her the most approachable of the sisters, continued to seek human connection wherever she could find it, with the servants, with the guards, with anyone who would treat her as a person rather than a symbol. Her friendliness alarmed her mother, who saw danger in every unguarded conversation, but Maria could not help it. Connection was her nature, and captivity could suppress it but not destroy it. And Anastasia, who turned 17 in June 1918, was old enough to understand the danger and young enough to resist it with the only weapon she had: humor, physical energy, and the stubborn refusal to behave as though the world had ended, even when most of the evidence suggested that it had. In the spring of 1918, the Bolshevik authorities ordered the family moved from Tobolsk to Yekaterinburg, an industrial city in the Urals, harder, more radical, closer to the front lines of the Civil War, and governed by the Ural Regional Soviet, whose hostility to the Romanovs was open, ideological, and uncompromising. The transfer was carried out in stages, and the separation of the family during the move is one of the cruelest details of this story. Nicholas, Alexandra, and Maria departed first. In late April, traveling by horse-drawn cart over muddy spring roads and then by train under armed guard. Olga, Tatiana, Anastasia, and Alexei, who was suffering from a severe hemophilia episode that left him unable to walk, remained behind in Tobolsk with a handful of attendants, waiting for the boy to recover enough to travel. The weeks of separation were agonizing for both groups. Alexandra wrote to the children she had left behind with the careful optimism of a mother trying not to frighten, and the children wrote back with the same studied calm, and beneath every line ran the unspoken fear that the family might not be reunited at all. When the remaining children and Alexei finally arrived in Yekaterinburg in late May, the family was brought together at the Ipatiev House, a two-story merchant's residence that the Ural Regional Soviet had requisitioned and surrounded with a high wooden palisade. The windows facing the street had been whitewashed so that the family could not see out and no one could see in. Guards were posted at every entrance. The local authorities had renamed the house with the grim bureaucratic precision of men who understood exactly what they were preparing. The House of Special Purpose. The family's world, which had been contracting steadily for 14 months, from an empire to a palace, from a palace to a governor's house in Siberia, from a governor's house to this, had now shrunk to a handful of rooms in a building whose very name announced that something final was being arranged. They did not know what was coming. They suspected, in the way that intelligent young people suspect things they cannot name, a change in the guards' demeanor, a tightening of restrictions, a quality of silence in the adults around them that was different from ordinary worry. But they could not know that the political logic of the revolution was moving, with a momentum that no individual act of diplomacy or rescue could have reversed, toward a conclusion that would treat them not as daughters and a son, not as young women and a boy with a bleeding disorder, who loved his dog, but as symbols of a system that the new Russia was determined to erase. The British monarchy by that spring had survived the crisis here. The Windsor name was established. The wartime image of George and Mary as dutiful, self-sacrificing servants of the nation was holding. The threat of Republican sentiment, which had flickered briefly in the labor unrest and political upheaval of 1917, had receded. The institution had proved once again that it knew how to read the weather and adjust accordingly. The cousin in the Urals, the cousin whose face looked like George's, whose children had once played near George's children on the lawns at Cowes, whose mother was George's aunt, had become, in the political calculus of Buckingham Palace, a problem that belonged to another country, another system, another world entirely. A problem that with sufficient silence and sufficient distance might simply cease to exist. One dynasty was stabilizing, the other was being prepared for liquidation, and the terrible asymmetry of those parallel trajectories, the cousin who edits and survives, the cousin who cannot edit and is consumed, that's the image that should carry the viewer into the next act, where the corridor narrows to its final width and the family that believed blood was a safety net discovers, in a basement room in a provincial city that most of Europe had never heard of, what it actually is. A detail in a file, a complication to be resolved, a problem that men with different loyalties and different priorities will solve in the most permanent way available to them. The Ipatiev House was not a prison in the architectural sense. It was a merchant's residence, solidly built, 2 stories of stucco over stone, standing on a slight rise at the corner of Voznesensky Prospect and Voznesensky Lane in the center of Yekaterinburg. It had belonged to a military engineer named Nikolai Ipatiev, who had been evicted from his own home at short notice when the Ural Regional Soviet requisitioned it in late April 1918 for the specific purpose of holding the Romanovs. The house had been prepared for that purpose with a thoroughness that spoke less of cruelty than of bureaucratic finality. The deliberate transformation of a private home into a controlled space from which escape was meant to be impossible and into which the outside world was not permitted to see. The fence, a high wooden palisade, twice the height of a man, constructed in the days before the family's arrival, enclosed the house and its small yard, cutting off the view from the street and the view from the upper windows. The windows themselves had been whitewashed on the inside, then covered with newspaper for additional opacity, and finally fitted with iron grills that turned every frame into a reminder that the world outside had been sealed away. Sentries were posted at the gates, at the corners of the fence, on the upper floor of a neighboring building that overlooked the yard, and at intervals along the street. A machine gun was mounted on the roof of the house. The family was permitted to walk in the garden for a set period each day, usually 30 minutes, sometimes less, under the direct supervision of armed guards. They were not permitted to open the windows. They were not permitted to lock their bedroom doors. They were not permitted to speak to anyone outside the household without the commandant's approval. The guards lived in the house alongside them, occupying the ground floor and the entrance hall, while the family was confined to the upper level, 5 rooms shared between 7 family members, their doctor, Yevgeny Botkin, and a small number of attendants whose continued presence the local Soviet tolerated with diminishing patience and increasing suspicion. The conditions at the Ipatiev House were not, in the beginning, physically brutal. The family was fed, not well, but adequately. The meals provided from a nearby Soviet canteen and supplemented, when the guards permitted it, by provisions brought by nuns from a local convent. They had beds, chairs, a table at which they took their meals together. They had some of their personal belongings, icons, which Alexandra arranged with care in the room she shared with Nicholas, photographs of the family in better times, a few books that had survived the successive confiscations of their captivity. Alexandra had her wheelchair, which she used increasingly as her health. Never robust, weakened by years of nervous strain and the cumulative toll of anxiety, continued to decline. Alexei had his spaniel, Joy, for a time. The dog was a comfort to the boy, a remnant of the ordinary childhood pleasures that his illness and his status had always made precarious. Eventually, the dog was taken away. The loss was small in the context of everything else the family had lost, but Alexei felt it, and his parents felt it on his behalf, which was perhaps the point. The psychological pressure, however, was relentless and cumulative, and it operated not through dramatic confrontations, but through the steady erosion of the small dignities that separate confinement from degradation. The guards were drawn from the local Bolshevik militia and from Cheka detachments, factory workers, former soldiers, men who regarded the former imperial family with a hostility that ranged from ideological contempt to personal malice to a coarse curiosity that was in its own way as dehumanizing as outright cruelty. Some stole from the family, small items, personal effects, things that had no value except to the people they belonged to. Some sang revolutionary songs outside the family's rooms, loudly and deliberately, late into the night. Some scrawled obscene graffiti on the walls of the single lavatory the family was permitted to use, crude drawings depicting Alexandra and Rasputin in sexual poses, caricatures of the Tsar, slogans about the fate of tyrants. The drawings were visible to the daughters every time they used the facility, and there was nothing they could do about them except look away. Some guards watched the young women with an attention that Alexandra found terrifying and that the girls dealt with by maintaining, as far as possible, the composure and the modesty they had been raised to show. Tatiana, who managed the family's daily routines with the same practical steadiness she had brought to every crisis, ensured that the sisters were never alone with the guards if it could be avoided. Olga bore the indignities with a quiet endurance that masked an increasingly fragile emotional state. Maria, whose natural friendliness had once led her to chat with the guards at Tobolsk, became more cautious at the Ipatiev house, as if she sensed that the men surrounding them now were different, harder, less reachable, less willing to see the family as people rather than enemies. There is something about those weeks in the Ipatiev house that resists dramatization, and the script must honor that resistance rather than override it. The family's final captivity was not cinematic, it was mundane. It was the slow erosion of dignity through small indignities repeated daily, the negotiation of a life that had been reduced to its most basic elements: eating, sleeping, waiting, praying, trying to keep Alexei safe, trying to keep the girls occupied, trying to find something to read, something to do, something to think about that was not the question. Nobody spoke aloud. Nicholas read to the family in the evenings, Tolstoy, the Bible, English novels. Alexandra sewed, prayed, and wrote in her diary, with entries that grew shorter and more strained as the weeks passed. The daughters played bezique and patience, games that required no equipment beyond a deck of cards and that could be played in silence, when silence was all the room could hold. Anastasia drew caricatures, including one of herself. Alexei, whose hemophilia had flared severely during the journey from Tobolsk, spent much of June confined to bed, unable to walk, carried by his father when he needed to be moved from one room to another, a 13-year-old boy in his father's arms, the heir to an empire that no longer existed, dependent on the strength of a man who had lost everything except the ability to lift his son. The doctor, Botkin, attended Alexei with the steady professionalism of a man who had chosen to follow the family into captivity, knowing what it might cost him. Yevgeny Sergeyevich Butkin had served as the imperial family's personal physician since 1908, a decade of attendance through the crises, the anxieties, and the daily medical vigil that Alexei's condition demanded. He had treated Alexei through dozens of hemophilia crises. He had followed the family from Tsarskoye Selo to Tobolsk to Yekaterinburg when he could, at any point, have chosen to walk away. He did not. He stayed because he believed it was his duty, and because he had come to regard the family not merely as patients, but as people he loved. In the Ipatiev House, he was the last remaining professional in the household, the last person whose presence was not a function of revolutionary bureaucracy, but of personal loyalty. He knew by July that the situation was likely to end in violence. He wrote a letter to a relative, a letter he never finished and never sent, in which he spoke of faith, of acceptance, and of a belief that God would not abandon the family even if men had. The letter was found after his death. He was 53 years old. The external forces bearing down on the Ipatiev House were converging from two directions, and the documentary must track both because it is their intersection that produces the catastrophe. From the east, the Czechoslovak Legion, a force of some 40,000 former prisoners of war and deserters from the Austro-Hungarian army who had been fighting their way along the Trans-Siberian Railway toward Vladivostok, was advancing through the Urals in alliance with anti-Bolshevik white forces. The Czechs had been nominal allies of the provisional government. After the Bolshevik seizure of power, they had become de facto enemies of the new regime, and their advance across Siberia had become the spine of the white military effort in the east. By late June and early July 1918, the Czechoslovak Legion and its white Russian allies were closing on Yekaterinburg. The sound of their artillery could occasionally be heard from the city. The Bolshevik garrison was preparing for a battle it was not certain it could win, and the presence of the former imperial family, the most symbolically valuable prisoners in Russia, transformed a military problem into an urgent political calculation. The Bolsheviks feared, not unreasonably, that the white forces would attempt to liberate the Romanovs and use the former Tsar, or his son, as a figurehead for the counter-revolution. A living Tsar was a rallying point. A dead Tsar was a problem solved. From Moscow, the central Bolshevik leadership, Lenin, Yakov Sverdlov, the men who were directing the revolution from behind desks in the Kremlin, were receiving telegraphic reports about the deteriorating military situation in the Urals. The question of who gave the final order for the execution, whether the decision was made in Moscow and communicated to the Ural Regional Soviet, or whether the Regional Soviet acted on its own initiative and received Moscow's retroactive approval, has been debated by historians for more than a century. Some evidence suggests that the Ural Soviets sought and received authorization from Moscow. Other evidence suggests that the local leaders, facing the imminent fall of the city, acted first and informed the center afterward. The documentary should acknowledge the debate without pretending to resolve it. What is not in dispute is that by early July 1918, the decision had been made. The family, all of them, not just Nicholas, was to be killed. The method was to be shooting. The timing would be determined by the approach of the white forces, which made every day of delay a risk. The man placed in charge of the operation was Yakov Yurovsky, a Bolshevik commissar who had replaced the previous commandant of the Ipatiev House in early July. Yurovsky was 40 years old, the son of a glazier from Tomsk, a former watchmaker who had been radicalized in his youth and who had spent years in exile and in Bolshevik underground work before the revolution gave him authority. He was methodical, ideologically committed, and efficient in the manner of a man who regarded political violence not as an aberration, but as a tool, a necessary instrument of the historical process he believed himself to be serving. He tightened security at the house. He inventoried the family's remaining possessions, noting each item with the precision of a shopkeeper taking stock. He arranged for a Fiat truck to be brought to the house on the appointed night, ostensibly to transport luggage, in reality to carry the bodies. He selected the members of the execution squad from among the guards and from a detachment of Cheka operatives. He planned the disposal of the remains in advance, identifying a site in the forest outside the city. He approached the task with the administrative thoroughness of a man who regarded it not as a murder, but as an assignment, a piece of revolutionary housekeeping whose moral dimension was, from his perspective, settled by the larger cause it served. The family did not know. They suspected the tightening security, the change of commandant, the removal of the remaining attendants one by one, the increased hostility of the guards. But suspicion is not knowledge, and hope, however thin, is remarkably difficult to extinguish in people who have survived as much as the Romanovs had survived. The last days of their lives were spent in the same routines that had sustained them through 16 months of captivity. Nicholas read the book of the prophet Amos in those final days and a volume of Chekhov. Alexandra prayed and wrote in her diary, her entries growing shorter, her handwriting less steady. The girls sewed, played cards, and took their permitted walks in the small fenced yard under the eyes of the sentries. Tatiana mended clothes, Anastasia sketched. Olga sat quietly, as she had been sitting quietly for months, in a stillness that had moved beyond composure into something closer to resignation. They tried to comfort Alexei, who was slowly recovering from the worst of his hemophilia episode and who had, by early July, begun to walk again with the aid of his father's arm, a small improvement that the family received with a relief out of all proportion to its significance, because in a world where nothing else was getting better, a boy taking a few steps was the only good news available. Botkin wrote his unfinished letter. He asked the family's permission to send it. The letter spoke of faith and acceptance. It spoke of the gratitude he felt for having been permitted to serve people whose goodness and simplicity had, he said, sustained him through the worst of what captivity had inflicted. He did not send it. Perhaps he did not finish it because he ran out of time. Perhaps he did not finish it because there was no way to send it. The letter was found among his effects after the Whites captured Yekaterinburg, and it survived. A small testament to a man whose courage was of the quietest and most devastating kind, the courage of someone who chooses to stay when staying means dying. The family attended a brief Orthodox service on July the 14th, 2 days before the end, conducted by a local priest and a deacon who were permitted to enter the house under guard. The service was a routine of captivity. Religious observance had been allowed at intervals throughout the family's confinement, but the priest, Father Ivan Storjev, later recalled that something about this particular service was different. The family appeared subdued, he said. At the point in the liturgy where the sung response to the prayer for the dead was customarily spoken, the family fell to their knees and wept. The deacon wept with them. Whether the family sensed what was coming, or whether the accumulated strain of 16 months of captivity had simply reached a point where grief could no longer be contained, is impossible to determine from the outside. What is certain is that the priest left the Ipatiev House that afternoon shaken, and that he carried the memory of that moment for the rest of his life. On the night of July the 16th, into the early hours of July the 17th, 1918, a Wednesday, Yurovsky woke the family and told them they were being moved. The reason given was that the city was becoming unstable, that there had been shooting in the streets, and that their safety required an immediate transfer to a new location. They were instructed to dress and to come downstairs. They did so without protest. They had been moved before. The pattern was familiar. Nicholas dressed and carried Alexei, who could not yet manage the stairs unaided. Alexandra brought a pillow and a small bag. The daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, dressed in the clothes into which they had sewn their remaining jewels. Diamonds, rubies, strands of pearls, stitched into the linings of their corsets and the hems of their garments as a precaution against the seizure of the last of their possessions. They did not know they were dressing for their deaths. They believed, or chose to believe, or had no choice but to act as though they believed that they were being moved again. Another journey, another set of rooms, another chapter in the captivity that had become their life. They were led down an internal staircase, 23 steps, to a semi-basement room on the ground floor of the house. The room was small, roughly 25 feet by 21, with a vaulted ceiling, a single window fitted with a heavy iron grille, striped wallpaper, and a door leading to an interior storeroom. There were no chairs. Alexandra, whose legs were swollen and who could not stand for long periods, asked for a chair. 2 were brought. She sat in one. Alexei was placed in the other beside her. Nicholas stood at the center of the room, slightly in front of his family, as though the instinct to shield them operated even in a space where shielding was no longer possible. The 4 daughters arranged themselves behind their parents. Botkin stood near Nicholas. The cook, Ivan Karitonov, the valet, Alexei Trupp, and the chambermaid, Anna Demidova, who carried a pillow stuffed with jewels, stood with them. 11 people in a room built for storage, waiting for a truck that they believed was coming to take them somewhere else. Yurovsky entered with the execution squad. Approximately 8 to 11 men, accounts vary, armed with Nagant revolvers and in some cases pistols of other makes. He positioned the squad in the doorway. He read a brief statement. Again, the precise wording varies across accounts, but the substance was that the Ural Regional Soviet of Workers' Deputies had decreed the execution of the former Tsar and that the sentence was to be carried out immediately. Nicholas turned to face Yurovsky. He is reported to have repeated the word, "What?" as though the sentence were a grammatical problem rather than a death warrant. He may have begun to turn toward his family. The shooting began before he could complete the gesture. The first volley was directed primarily at Nicholas, who was killed almost instantly. Alexandra had time to raise her hand in the sign of the cross before she was struck. Botkin, Karatonov, and Trupp fell in the same fusillade. But the daughters and Alexei did not die in the first volley. The diamonds and jewels sewn into the young women's corsets deflected the bullets, turning their clothing into an improvised and inadequate armor that prolonged their agony without saving their lives. The execution squad, confronted with victims who were still alive, crying out, attempting to crawl, shielding one another, fired again and then again. When the bullets failed to finish the killing, bayonets were used. Demidova, the chambermaid, was bayoneted repeatedly, the pillow she clutched absorbing some of the blows. Anastasia, who survived the initial gunfire, was bayoneted on the floor. Alexei, who was still alive after the first volleys, was shot at close range by Yurovsky himself. The room filled with gunpowder smoke so thick that the executioners could barely see. Bullets ricocheted off the stone walls. Some of the squad were nearly hit by their own colleagues' fire. Yurovsky later wrote in the account he prepared for the Soviet archives that the operation had not gone as planned, that the killing had been prolonged, chaotic, and more difficult than he had anticipated. The entire process, from the first shot to the confirmation that all 11 people in the room were dead, lasted approximately 20 minutes. The documentary must handle this scene with the greatest possible restraint, and it must do so not out of squeamishness, but out of respect. For the people who died, for the viewers who will carry this scene with them, and for the narrative principle that the facts of this particular killing are devastating enough without the addition of dramatic language. The power is in the compression and in the contrast. A family that once occupied the ceremonial center of the largest empire on the earth, ending in a basement room in a provincial city. A father who carried his sick son down the stairs. Daughters whose last act of self-preservation, the jewels hidden in their clothes, prolonged their suffering rather than saving them. A boy who was 13 years old and who had never been well. The scene should feel not like a climax in the dramatic sense, but like the final collapse of something that had been contracting for months. The last smallest room in a long sequence of shrinking rooms. History did not kill the Romanovs with a trumpet blast. It killed them with a summons downstairs. After the shooting, the bodies were wrapped in soldiers' shirts and bed sheets, loaded onto the waiting Fiat truck, and driven out of the city in the pre-dawn darkness. Yurovsky had prepared a disposal site, an abandoned mine shaft in the forest near the village of Ganina Yama, known as the Four Brothers, approximately 12 miles north of Yekaterinburg. The initial plan was to drop the bodies down the shaft, douse them with acid, and collapse the mine entrance. But the plan went wrong almost immediately. The shaft was too shallow, the water level was too high, the bodies were too numerous and too heavy for the small detail of men assigned to the task. The truck became stuck in mud on the forest track. Acid was used to disfigure the faces, making later identification more difficult. An attempt was made to burn some of the remains in a clearing. Eventually, after more than a day of improvised, exhausting, and increasingly panicked disposal efforts, most of the bodies were buried in a shallow pit near a road crossing in the Koptiaki forest, concealed beneath a layer of railway sleepers, earth, and brushwood. Two of the bodies, later identified through forensic analysis as Alexei and one of the daughters, most likely Maria, were separated from the others and buried in a smaller pit some distance away. The concealment was meant to be permanent. The secrecy was meant to be total. Neither proved to be. In Yekaterinburg on July the 18th, the Ural Regional Soviet issued a brief public announcement. The former Tsar, Nicholas Romanov, had been shot by order of the Presidium of the Regional Soviet. The announcement said nothing about the family. It said nothing about Alexandra. It said nothing about the children. The official line, maintained for weeks, and then for months, and then for decades, was that Nicholas alone had been executed, and that the family His wife, his son, his 4 daughters had been moved to a safe place. The lie was deliberate and it was sustained, not out of guilt or moral scruple, but out of a calculation that the killing of an empress and 5 children, including 4 young women and a hemophiliac boy, might provoke a reaction among foreign governments and neutral publics that the revolution could not afford at a moment when it was fighting for its survival on multiple fronts. The Bolshevik leadership in Moscow, Sverdlov announced the Tsar's execution to the All-Russian Central Executive Committee on July the 18th, confirmed Nicholas's death, but maintained the fiction about the family with a discipline that suggests the cover story had been agreed upon in advance. Foreign governments inquired. The Danish royal family, Maria Feodorovna's relatives, the Romanovs' closest surviving kin in Western Europe, pressed for information. The British government inquired through diplomatic channels and received answers that were evasive, contradictory, and ultimately meaningless. George V's court made representation that were by this point more a matter of form than of substance. The polite inquiries of an institution that had already decided more than a year earlier that the Romanov problem was someone else's to solve. The family had simply vanished into rumor, into conflicting reports, into the fog of revolutionary secrecy and civil war chaos, into a silence that would be maintained in its essential shape for more than 7 decades. The White forces captured Yekaterinburg 8 days after the execution, on July the 25th. They found the Ipatiev House empty, the walls of the basement room scarred by bullets, the floor stained with what was later confirmed to be blood. They found fragments of the family's belongings. They found the obscene graffiti. They did not find the bodies. And it was from that silence, that deliberate, maintained, bureaucratically enforced absence of confirmed fact, that the myths began to grow. Within months of the execution, reports began to surface that one or more of the children had survived. The claims attached themselves most durably to the name of Anastasia, the youngest daughter, the irrepressible one, the girl whose energy and mischief had made her a favorite of the popular imagination even before the revolution. The survival legend offered the world something it desperately wanted, the possibility that a story this terrible could not have been complete, that in the darkest room there was still a crack through which someone escaped. The claims proliferated for decades. Imposters and pretenders appeared in asylums and drawing rooms across Europe, each claiming to be the Grand Duchess who had somehow lived. The most famous of them, a woman known as Anna Anderson, sustained her claim for more than 60 years, attracting supporters, legal battles, book deals, and a degree of public fascination that said more about the world's hunger for a redemptive ending than it did about the evidence. DNA testing in the 1990s finally disproved Anderson's claim. But the power of the Anastasia myth was never really about evidence. It was about the need to believe that death, even when administered by a firing squad in a cellar, could be cheated, and about the deeper need to believe that innocence, represented by a young woman who had done nothing to deserve her fate, could not be entirely extinguished by the political machinery that had consumed her family. The truth was simpler and worse. There was no escape. The family died together in the same room at the same hour within minutes of one another. Nicholas, 50 years old. Alexandra, 46. Olga, 22. Tatiana, 21. Maria, 19. Anastasia, 17. Alexei, 13. Botkin, the doctor who stayed. Kharitonov, the cook. Trapp, the valet. Demidova, the chambermaid. 11 people. The dynasty that had ruled Russia for 304 years did not end with a last battle or a final decree. It ended with a truck in the dark, a mine shaft in the forest, and a lie told to the world the next morning. And in London, the cousin who had withdrawn the offer of asylum 17 months earlier continued his reign. George V would live until January 1936. He would never publicly acknowledge the palace's role in the withdrawal of the asylum offer. He would never speak in any recorded setting about what he knew and when he knew it. The official story is that the government had made the decision independently, that the palace had been a bystander to events it could not control, would hold for decades, hardening into the accepted version through repetition, institutional silence, and the natural tendency of established narratives to resist revision. The letters that told the real story, Stamfordham's careful, courteous, devastating letters to Balfour, would sit in archives examined by a handful of scholars, while the myth of a blameless monarchy settled into the national memory like sediment in still water. The family was dead, but the story, The story of responsibility, of memory, of what the British public would be permitted to know and what would be quietly buried alongside the bodies in the Kopsiaki forest, of how the myth of a blameless monarchy would be constructed and maintained and eventually, decades later, challenged, was only beginning. The white forces that captured Yekaterinburg on July the 25th, 1918, 8 days after the execution, found the Ipatiev House abandoned. The guards had fled. The commandant had disappeared. The rooms on the upper floor were in disorder, the family's remaining possessions scattered and partially looted, books with their spines broken, photographs torn from frames, clothing rifled through and discarded. On the ground floor, in the semi-basement room, investigators found what the hasty cleanup had failed to conceal. Bullet holes in the walls and the floor, deep gouges from bayonet thrusts in the plaster and the floorboards, and extensive staining on the wood that chemical analysis would later confirm as human blood. They found fragments of personal effects, buttons, buckles, a small devotional medallion, a piece of jewelry that had escaped a disposal operation. They did not find the bodies. The White investigation, led first by a local examining magistrate and then, from February 1919, by a judicial investigator named Nikolai Sokolov, pursued the case with a tenacity that reflected both professional duty and a deepening horror at what the evidence revealed. Sokolov traveled to the mine shafts at Ganina Yama, where local witnesses reported seeing bonfires and smelling burning in the days after the family's disappearance. From the ashes and the mud, he recovered bone fragments, melted lead from bullets, portions of corset stays, stiffened with whalebone, a set of false teeth identified as Dr. Botkin's, a severed finger belonging to a middle-aged woman, believed to be Alexandra, and most poignantly, the charred remnants of a small shoe buckle that was consistent with footwear belonging to one of the younger children. Sokolov compiled his findings into a detailed investigative file that he carried out of Russia as the civil war turned against the whites. He spent the remainder of his life in France, working on the case, interviewing witnesses, and preparing a comprehensive account that was published posthumously. He died in November 1924 at the age of 42 in circumstances that some have suggested were suspicious, though no evidence of foul play has been established. His file survived him and would eventually become one of the foundational documents of the historical record, the most thorough contemporaneous investigation of the execution, assembled by a man who understood that the truth of what had happened in the Ipatiev house would matter long after the political forces that had caused it had themselves become history. The Russian political actors, who had briefly held the Romanovs' fate in their hands during the months of the provisional government, did not, for the most part, survive to old age and comfort. Pavel Milyukov, the liberal foreign minister who had been willing to facilitate the family's departure in March 1917, was forced out of government within weeks of the asylum offer's withdrawal. He spent the rest of his life in emigration, first in London, then in Paris, writing, lecturing, and watching from a distance as the country he had tried to reform consumed itself. He died in France in March 1943, at the age of 83, during the German occupation. Prince Lvov, the head of the provisional government who had represented the narrow, fragile window in which exile still seemed possible, also emigrated. He settled in Paris, living modestly, and died in March 1925. Both men had believed that Russia could transition peacefully from autocracy to liberal democracy. Both had been proved catastrophically wrong, and both had been overtaken by events that moved faster than anyone's good intentions could manage. A lesson that applied, in a different key, to the British actors in the story as well. The aftermath of the execution unfolded across two very different worlds, and the documentary must track both because the contrast between them is the story's final and most damning revelation. In Russia, the Romanov name was systematically erased from public life with a thoroughness that only a revolutionary state possessed the apparatus to achieve. The Bolsheviks did not destroy the Ipatiev House immediately. It stood for nearly 6 decades, serving variously as a regional administrative office and a repository for local archives, while the rooms in which the family had been killed were quietly sealed off and in later years became an unofficial site of pilgrimage for those who knew the history and dared to visit. The house was finally demolished in 1977 on the orders of the local Communist Party chief, a rising official named Boris Yeltsin, who would, in one of history's more pointed ironies, later preside as president of the Russian Federation over the exhumation of the Romanovs' remains and their state reburial. The demolition was carried out at night, rapidly and without public announcement, in a manner that recalled the execution itself. An act performed in the dark and explained afterward. Streets across the former empire were renamed. Statues and portraits were removed. The palaces were turned into museums, their imperial furnishings preserved not as tributes to a dynasty, but as exhibits documenting the decadence of the system the revolution had been built to destroy. For 70 years, the Soviet state maintained the essential fiction that the details of the family's end were either unknown or unimportant. The execution of Nicholas was acknowledged in general terms. The killing of the family was neither confirmed nor denied, with the specificity that would have permitted mourning or accountability. The location of the graves was held as a state secret by a succession of officials who understood that the bodies, if found, would become both evidence and relics, and that either function was dangerous to the narrative the state had constructed around them. In Britain, a different kind of suppression was underway, quieter, more genteel, and ultimately more successful, because it did not rely on censorship or demolition, but on the far more durable mechanisms of institutional discretion, controlled narrative, and the British establishment's deep and practiced understanding of how to manage what the public was permitted to know. George V continued his reign through the post-war years with the same combination of caution, symbolic adaptability, and sensitivity to public mood that had carried him through the conflict. He visited the industrial towns. He met wounded soldiers. He performed the rituals of national mourning and national recovery that cemented the Windsor brand as a symbol of continuity, service, and the nation's better instincts. He did not speak publicly about the Romanovs. The palace did not issue statements about the asylum question. The correspondence between Stamfordham and Balfour, the letters that documented in courteous and devastating detail the palace's role in the withdrawal of the asylum offer, remained in the royal archives, unexamined by the press, unknown to the public, and unchallenged by the historians who relied on official sources for their accounts of the period. The version of events that entered the public record, repeated in authorized biographies and court histories for more than 60 years, held that it was David Lloyd George's wartime government that had withdrawn the offer of sanctuary, and that the king had been a sympathetic but powerless bystander to a political decision over which he had no control. It was a clean story. It was a convenient story. And it was, in its essential substance, a fiction constructed to protect the crown. The fiction held until the early 1980s, when the historian Kenneth Rose, researching his biography of George V, gained access to papers that had previously been restricted or overlooked. Rose's work, and the subsequent research of other scholars who followed the archival trail he opened, established beyond reasonable dispute that the withdrawal of the asylum offer had originated not with the government but with the palace, that it was Stamfordham, acting on the king's expressed anxiety, who had pressed Balfour to abandon the proposal, and that the government had complied with the palace's wishes while allowing the king to remain publicly invisible in the decision. The revelation did not produce a constitutional crisis. By the 1980s, the events were 70 years old, the principles were long dead, and the British public's appetite for holding the monarchy accountable for wartime decisions made by George V was limited. But the archival evidence changed the historical understanding of the episode permanently, and it created the interpretive framework within which this documentary operates. The knowledge that the most natural refuge available to the Romanovs was closed not by circumstance alone, but by a deliberate institutional choice, made inside the British monarchy, and then concealed for the better part of a century. George V died on January the 20th, 1936, at Sandringham House in Norfolk, at the age of 70. His physician, Lord Dawson of Penn, administered a lethal injection of morphine and cocaine to hasten the king's death, a fact that was not disclosed publicly until Dawson's diary was published in 1986, adding another layer to the history of managed narratives that characterized the Windsor court. George's final years had been marked by declining health, bronchitis, septicemia, and the cumulative toll of decades of heavy smoking, by the constitutional crises of the early 1930s, and by a growing anxiety about the behavior of his eldest son, the future Edward VIII, whose romantic entanglement with the American divorcee Wallis Simpson was heading toward a crisis that would, within months of George's death, produce the abdication of 1936. That abdication, another moment in which the British monarchy's survival would depend on its willingness to sacrifice a family member for institutional continuity, was, in a sense, the second act of the same drama that had played out with the Romanovs 20 years earlier. The principle was the same. The institution came first. The person inside it came second. George V had reigned for 25 years. He had steered the monarchy through a world war, a revolutionary era that destroyed four European empires, the general strike of 1926, and a transformation of British society that would have been unrecognizable to the sovereigns who preceded him. He had done so by understanding, more clearly than any monarch since Victoria, that the crown survived not through the exercise of power, but through the management of perception, through the careful calibration of what the public saw, what the public believed, and what the public was never permitted to discover. The Romanov asylum withdrawal was perhaps the starkest example of that principle in action, and it remained hidden for the entirety of his reign and for nearly 50 years beyond it. Queen Mary survived him by 17 years, dying in March 1953 at Marlborough House in London, 10 weeks before the coronation of her granddaughter, Elizabeth II. She was 85 years old. She had been, in her quiet, formidable way, the model of a consort who subordinated every personal feeling to institutional requirement. A woman whose public composure never cracked, whose private griefs remained precisely private, and whose commitment to the monarchy as a working institution, rather than a family arrangement, was as deep as her husband's. She did not speak publicly about the Romanovs. She did not, in any recorded setting, discuss what she knew about the asylum withdrawal or what she felt about the family whose destruction had occurred during the years of her consortship. The Romanovs were, in the Windsor court, a subject handled with the same controlled silence that the palace applied to every other inconvenient truth. Maria Feodorovna, Dagmar of Denmark, Nicholas's mother, George's aunt, the woman who connected the two courts through the Danish bloodline that had once made the whole system feel like a family, survived the revolution and escaped Russia in April 1919. The British government, belatedly recognizing an obligation it had failed to extend to her son, arranged her evacuation from Crimea aboard HMS Marlborough, along with other members of the extended Romanov family who had taken refuge in the south of Russia as the civil war consumed the country. She was 71 years old. She settled in Denmark, first with her nephew, King Christian X, at the Amalienborg Palace in Copenhagen, and later at the Videra Villa nearby. She spent the last 9 years of her life in a condition of dignified, stubborn, heartbreaking denial. When visitors brought news of the execution, when evidence accumulated, when accounts were published, or when the Sokolov investigation's findings became known, she refused to accept them. She maintained, to the end, the belief, or the performance of belief, which in a woman of her generation and her upbringing may have amounted to the same thing, that Nicholas, Alexandra, and the children were alive somewhere, waiting to be found. She died in October 1928 at the age of 80. She was the last major figure of the older dynastic generation, the generation that had believed royal kinship was a genuine safety net, and she died without ever confronting the discovery that the net had been withdrawn by the people she trusted most. Lord Stamfordham, the private secretary whose letters had done more than any other single document to close the door on asylum, continued to serve George V with quiet efficiency until his own death in March 1931. He was 81. He had spent nearly half a century in royal service, first as private secretary to Queen Victoria, then to George V, and he had done his work with a combination of discretion, institutional loyalty, and administrative precision that made him, in the eyes of the palace, indispensable. Whether he ever reflected privately on the consequences of the correspondence he conducted with Balfour in April 1917, whether the letters that helped seal the Romanovs' fate ever cost him sleep, is entirely unknown. He left no memoir. He gave no interviews. He made no recorded statement about the asylum question. He was a courtier to the end, and courtiers, by training and by temperament, do not confess. The record he left was the record of the letters themselves. Polite, careful, devastating, and they speak in their measured civil service prose more clearly than any confession could. Sir George Buchanan, the ambassador who had sounded the alarm from Petrograd and watched the alarm be ignored, was recalled from Russia in January 1918, 6 months before the execution, his health shattered by the strain of serving in a capital that was disintegrating around him. He returned to England, lived quietly, and published a diplomatic memoir, My Mission to Russia, in 1923, a careful and restrained account that was notable for what it included and what it did not. He described the asylum offer. He did not describe the palace's role in its withdrawal. Whether the omission reflected discretion, ignorance of the full picture, or a gentleman's unwillingness to embarrass the crown is unclear. He died in December 1924 at the age of 70. He was the man who had tried to keep the door open, and the story of his failure was tidied away, like so much else in this history, into the archives where it would rest, largely undisturbed, for more than half a century. The bodies were found in 1979. A Russian geologist and amateur historian named Alexander Avdonin, working from accounts that had circulated for years in Samizdat, the unofficial, hand-copied documents that served as an underground press in the Soviet Union, located the burial site near the Koptyaki road crossing. Together with a Moscow filmmaker named Gely Ryabov, who had obtained access to archival material through connections in the Soviet security apparatus, Avdonin excavated several of the skulls from the shallow grave. The discovery was, in the context of the late Brezhnev era, politically dangerous. The Soviet state had spent 6 decades burying the truth of the Romanov execution alongside the bodies, and 2 private citizens who had unearthed both were in a position of considerable vulnerability. Avdonin and Ryabov reburied the remains and kept their discovery secret for nearly a decade, waiting for the political climate to change. It did. The glasnost era of the late 1980s and then the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 made disclosure possible. The full exhumation took place in July 1991, supervised by Russian forensic authorities. 9 of the 11 bodies were recovered from the main burial pit. DNA analysis, conducted by British and Russian forensic teams in a collaboration that carried its own freight of historical irony, confirmed that the remains belonged to Nicholas, Alexandra, 3 of the 4 daughters, identified as Olga, Tatiana, and Anastasia, and the 4 attendants who had died with them. The identification was made partly through comparison with DNA samples provided by Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, a great-nephew of Empress Alexandra through the maternal Hesse line, whose genetic material was used to confirm the identity of the relatives that the same royal institution had 74 years earlier declined to save. The forensic science was meticulous. The irony was inescapable. The blood that had once connected 2 royal families across a continent, and that had failed to protect the Russian branch when protection was most needed, now served in its molecular form to name the dead. In 2007, the remains of the 2 missing individuals, Alexei and one of the daughters, believed to be Maria, were found in a separate, smaller pit approximately 70 meters from the main grave, at a depth of about 60 centimeters. Their identification was confirmed through further DNA analysis. The family, separated in death by the haste and improvisation of their killers, was finally complete. In 1998, 80 years after the execution, the remains of Nicholas, Alexandra, and 3 of their daughters were interred in the Cathedral of Saints Peter and Paul in St. Petersburg, the traditional burial place of the Romanov emperors, where Peter the Great and Catherine the Great and generations of czars lay beneath the cathedral's marble floor. The state funeral, held on July the 17th, the anniversary of the execution, was attended by Russian President Boris Yeltsin, who stood before the coffins and offered what amounted to a national reckoning with the crime, speaking of the need to bury the remains with honor and to close one of the most shameful pages in the country's history. The man who had ordered the Ipatiev House demolished was now presiding over the reburial of the people who had been murdered inside it. Members of European royal families attended the ceremony. The British royal family sent Prince Michael of Kent, a cousin of Queen Elizabeth II. The Russian Orthodox Church, which had initially questioned the forensic identification and hesitated over the propriety of the ceremony, canonized the family 2 years later, in 2000, as passion bearers, a category of saints recognized not for the holiness of their lives, but for the manner of their deaths, accepted with faith, humility, and without resistance. The canonization transformed the Romanovs, in the eyes of millions of Orthodox believers worldwide, from historical figures into objects of veneration, their icons hung in churches, their feast day observed, their suffering incorporated into the liturgical life of a faith that Nicholas and Alexandra had practiced with the intensity that had defined and in its own way distorted their entire lives. The cultural afterlife of the Romanov story has been extensive, and it has consistently illuminated certain aspects of the tragedy while leaving others in shadow. A pattern that is itself part of the story this documentary exists to address. The Anastasia myth, which began within months of the execution and persisted for the better part of a century, was perhaps the most powerful of the early afterlife narratives. The most famous claimant, a woman who first appeared in a Berlin asylum in 1920 under the name Anna Anderson, maintained for more than 60 years that she was the Grand Duchess Anastasia, the youngest daughter who had somehow survived the cellar. Her claim attracted supporters, detractors, legal proceedings that wound through European courts for decades, and a degree of public fascination that spoke less to the plausibility of her story than to the depth of the world's need for a redemptive ending. Anderson's claim was the subject of books, articles, a 1956 film starring Ingrid Bergman, and an animated feature by Fox in 1997 that turned the survival legend into a musical fairy tale. DNA testing in the 1990s established conclusively that Anderson was not Anastasia. She was, in all probability, a Polish factory worker named Franziska Chanskowska. But the myth she embodied outlived the science that disproved it, because the hunger for escape from the finality of the cellar was stronger than evidence. The 1971 film Nicholas and Alexandra, directed by Franklin J. Schaffner, starring Michael Jaston as Nicholas and Janet Suzman as Alexandra, was one of the most ambitious attempts to dramatize the fall of the dynasty for a Western audience. Produced by Sam Spiegel, shot on location and on lavish sets, the film presented the story as a tragic epic on the grand scale. The doomed czar, the passionate empress, the corrupting influence of Rasputin, the inexorable forces of revolution. It won Academy Awards for its art direction and costume design, and was nominated for several more. It was handsomely made, emotionally engaged, and, in its treatment of the British dimension of the story, virtually silent. The film's narrative centered on the internal dynamics of the Russian family and court. The British asylum question, the letters, the withdrawal, the palace's role, barely registered. The cousin in London was, in Schaffner's telling, simply not part of the story. Netflix's 2019 docudrama The Last Tsars repackaged the narrative for a modern streaming audience, mixing dramatic reconstruction with commentary from historians and descendants. It brought production values and accessibility, but followed the same essential template: the Russian family's downfall, Rasputin's influence, the revolution, the execution. The British angle received somewhat more attention than in the 1971 film, but it remained secondary, a complication in a story whose center of gravity was understood to be Russian. The pattern is consistent across most adaptations and retellings, from popular histories to television documentaries to theatrical productions. The Romanovs are presented as victims of the Russian Revolution, their story framed as a tragedy of Russian history, of autocracy, of war, of the collision between an old world and a new one. The British monarchy's role, its offer and withdrawal of asylum, its decades of institutional silence, its careful management of the historical record, is treated, when it appears at all, as a footnote rather than a structural element. That gap between what the public knows and what the record shows is precisely the space this documentary occupies. What remains in the present tense is not a living Romanov dynasty in the political sense. There is no throne to reclaim, no succession to contest, but something more diffuse and perhaps more durable: an archive, a mythology, a sacred memory, and a contrast that continues to illuminate the choices both monarchies made more than a century ago. The site of the Ipatiev House in Yekaterinburg is now occupied by the Church on Blood in honor of All Saints. Resplendent in the Russian land, a Russian Orthodox cathedral built between 2000 and 2003 on the exact footprint of the demolished house. The church, with its white walls and gilded domes, draws pilgrims and tourists from across Russia and the world. The basement level of the cathedral corresponds to the location of the room in which the family was killed, and it contains a chapel dedicated to their memory. Each year, on the anniversary of the execution, tens of thousands of people participate in a procession from the church to the Ganina Yama monastery, built near the site where the bodies were first disposed of. The Romanovs, in death, have become what they could never be in life: figures of uncomplicated reverence, their political failures and personal limitations smoothed away by martyrdom and by the passage of time. The British monarchy still exists. It still bears the name that George V chose in July 1917. The name that was part of the same institutional survival strategy that led the palace to withdraw the offer of asylum 2 months earlier. The House of Windsor has navigated a century of social transformation, 2 more world wars, decolonization, the media revolution, and a succession of personal scandals and family crises: Edward VI's abdication, the collapse of Charles and Diana's marriage, the death of the Princess of Wales, the departure of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, each of which tested the same principle that George V established in the year the Romanovs were abandoned: that the institution matters more than the individuals within it, and that survival requires the willingness to adapt, to edit, to sacrifice sentiment to strategy when the institution's credibility is at stake. Whether that principle is admirable or ruthless depends on where you stand. What is not in dispute is that it has worked. The monarchy endures. The family that learned to stop behaving like a family when the political cost of family feeling became too high is still here. The Romanovs survive in a different form. They survive in the photographs, those endlessly reproduced images of a beautiful family in white, posed on yachts and palace terraces, smiling into cameras that recorded a world about to disappear. They survive in the forensic record, the DNA, the bone fragments, the bullets recovered from forest graves. They survive in the Orthodox liturgical calendar, where they are commemorated as saints whose suffering sanctified them. They survive in the cultural imagination, where their story continues to generate films, books, exhibitions, ballets, and a public fascination that shows no sign of diminishing. And they survive, perhaps most powerfully, in the unanswered moral question that their story poses to every institution that claims to value loyalty, kinship, and the obligations of blood. What does it mean to be related to people you are willing to let die? This is not finally a story about whether George V murdered the Romanovs. That framing is too simple and too satisfying, and the record does not support it. George did not order the execution. He did not cause the revolution. He did not create the political conditions that made the Romanov dynasty untenable, or the military circumstances that made the family's captivity lethal. What he did, what his household did, through the careful, courteous, devastating mechanism of private letters and diplomatic suggestion, was withdraw the one offer of refuge that might have removed the family from danger at the moment when removal was still possible, and then allow the withdrawal to be attributed to someone else for more than 60 years. It is a story about the price of institutional survival, what it costs, who pays it, and how the people who make those calculations later arrange the record so that the cost is borne by history rather than by conscience. The monarchy that endured in Britain did so in part by learning when to stop behaving like a family. The tragedy for the Romanovs was that they still believed family feeling, old blood, shared memory. The photograph of two cousins who looked like brothers might count for more than political danger. It did not. And there is no neat moral in that. There is only the image of one dynasty vanishing while another quietly rewrote itself and carried on.